Welcome back to Western Religions. This is a video series for a college course using the World Religions Western Traditions textbook from Oxford University Press, 5th edition, as kind of the baseline, although I sometimes add my own additional commentary or interpretation. In terms of a bit of context, although this video is focused on looking at the modern Western secular scholarship on Christianity, I myself am a recent convert to Roman Catholic Christianity. So occasionally I may note a different perspective from that usually shared in academic circles. In this video, we're going to look at the history of Christianity from the Protestant Reformation up to the modern era. Let's start with the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation emerged out of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a rebirth of literature, art, and culture based on a revival of ancient Greek and Roman culture. This happened originating in Italy in the 13 and 1400s and then spreading to the rest of Western Europe. One of the key ideas of the Renaissance was the slogan ad fontes, or to the sources. It was a call for a return to the original Greek and Latin source texts that lay at the root of much of Western culture. For example, reading the philosopher Plato or Aristotle in the original Greek and reading the Latin letters and other texts written by Cicero and other famous ancient Roman writers. Humanism was one of the main philosophies or ideologies of the Renaissance. Humanism has various kinds, but what they had in common, especially in the Renaissance, was a sometimes subtle, sometimes more overt shift in emphasis of the values of this world rather than that of heaven or an afterlife or a spiritual or otherworldly realm. The Renaissance humanists were mostly Christian, but relative to a lot of the Christian scholars, artists, writers of the Middle Ages, they tended to celebrate human beauty, wisdom, and reason, the beauty and wonder of the earth or the creation, more than that of God or the afterlife, and so on. And they were optimistic about the capacity of humans to use reason and free will to understand the world and to govern themselves. So overall, it was a more worldly philosophy. Petrarch was an early Renaissance figure in Italy who lived from 1304 to 1374. He was an Italian poet who was influenced by the style of classical Latin poetry and literature and helped reintroduce that classical style into the West. Erasmus was a Christian scholar who lived from 1466 to 1536. He was an Augustinian priest from Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and he advocated for a reform in the Catholic Church. So he was an example of someone who was a part of the Renaissance, but who also played a role in the Reformation. The ideas of the Renaissance of returning to the original Greek and Latin source literature influenced some reformers like Erasmus, who advocated for a return to the original sources of the Bible, i.e. the Tanakh in the original Hebrew, the Old Testament, and the New Testament in the original Greek, rather than just studying the Latin Vulgate translation, which by then was used throughout the West. The Protestant Reformation was a movement of protest against the Catholic Church that led to schism into many separate Western churches and movements. Some background were changes in the society, the economy, the technology. There was commercial growth, i.e. in banking and long-distance trade, during the period of the Renaissance. In the 1400s, the printing press with movable metal type was invented in Germany by Johannes Gutenberg. This lowered the cost of printing, which helped spread the ideas of Protestant reformers. Together with the increase in availability of books and other printed materials, there was an increase in literacy throughout Western Europe. There was also widespread dissatisfaction with church corruption, such as bishops who lived wealthy, lavish lifestyles, There were ecclesiastical lords or people who had the role of bishop or another rank of clergy in the hierarchy who also owned large estates and lands just like other nobles. And many of the bishoprics were controlled by powerful noble families. In terms of the role of the church in society, it played a very big role. It was very public. It wasn't just like a small private institution. The church was the single largest landowner in Europe, and it provided a lot of social services like healthcare and education. People's lives, their daily lives, were intimately connected with the church, even when taking a vacation, which would usually be in the form of a pilgrimage to a sacred shrine, when performing public devotions, participating in funeral masses, and a lot of people tried to get forgiveness for their sins or enact penance for their sins by purchasing indulgences. These were basically allowing you to have time off from the years you would otherwise have to spend after death in purgatory, getting your soul cleansed of sin by doing acts of charity in the world. So the idea in the Catholic Church is that if you sin, you have to go to a priest and confess your sin, and there'll be prescribed acts of penance to help you overcome the sin. You also have to have a sincerely contrite and remorseful heart. But the church ended up using various types of financial donations, including the construction of new cathedrals and things like that, through the sale of indulgences, which would have the practical effect of an act of penance, similar. So the idea became that you could essentially buy your way out of certain penances just by giving money for the sale of these indulgences. And that was one of the controversial practices of the Catholic Church of the Renaissance era that was criticized by some Protestant reformers. On the one hand, you could say that this was just a way of organizing acts of charity that would benefit the church and society, but it could also be done more cynically and in a more kind of quid pro quo fashion. So this was just an example of how pervasive the church was to daily life and how the Protestant reformers, if they saw the church as corrupt, they would be highly motivated to take a public stand against it and to try to communicate those ideas to other people. And that's exactly what happened in the Reformation. Martin Luther was the reformer who started the Protestant Reformation. He lived between 1483 and 1546. He was the son of a miner from the state of Saxony in Germany, which then was known as the Holy Roman Empire. He was a friar in an Augustinian order, so he followed the rule of St. Augustine. Friars were a type of clergy who were mendicants or beggars, and they would basically go around preaching the gospel. That was their original vocation. By the time of Luther, many friars, like Luther himself, were actually scholars who would study and teach at universities. He earned his Doctor of Theology in the year 1512, and he became a professor of scripture at the University of Wittenberg, also in Germany. So his key break with the Catholic Church was on the doctrine of sola fide, or justification through faith alone. Sola is Latin for alone, fide means by faith. Luther had struggled with the church's teachings and practices connected to salvation. So he was worried that he wouldn't have sincere enough repentance in order to overcome his sins, for example. This led to the so-called Tower experience, where Luther became convinced that humans are justified, which he thought of as being made right with God, essentially, through faith alone, and that this faith that is sufficient and necessary for justification and thus for salvation could not be provided by human will. It's a gift of God's grace. Luther believed that a person with such faith is assured of salvation, and that people cannot earn their justification through works. He was getting this from his interpretation of the letters of St. Paul. Historically speaking, when Paul wrote about salvation through faith and not through works for Christians, he was probably referring to works in the sense of observances or halachot of the Mosaic law. But Luther interpreted that terminology from Paul more broadly. So it's not just the idea that Christians can't be saved through performing the commandments and other rabbinical observances related to the law of Moses or the Old Covenant, but rather that even works of charity or other acts following the Christian commandments to love God and to love neighbor, those were also not fundamentally involved in the process of salvation, according to Luther. Rather, it's this inward state of faith in God. The faith in God, Jesus' sacrifice to God the Father, mediated by the Holy Spirit, that's what you need in order to attain salvation. But with this, in Luther, comes that idea as well of sola gratia, or only by the grace of God. So Luther thought that God's grace is necessary and sufficient for faith. Humans can't give themselves the faith of salvation, in other words, through their own free will or choice. It's something that has to be given by God. And both of these interpretations, you could say, conflicted with the standard view of the Catholic Church. It's complex how to spell that out, but basically the Catholic position is closer to thinking that both faith and works of charity are necessary for salvation and that they're jointly sufficient. The reason why it is a little bit trickier than that is because Catholics generally believe as well that if you have the faith, it will inevitably issue in works of charity, so that practically speaking, the two go together, at least practically. And so it's at least somewhat misleading, you might say, to regard them as separately necessary and only jointly sufficient. But anyway, that should help to clarify how this was subtly different from the Catholic view of salvation. And Luther, he refused to budge on this point in his various debates with the church. And it was one of the main reasons why he eventually ended up breaking with the Catholic Church, even though his original intention was probably just to reform the church. So Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg in the year 1517. This was a standard practice among theologians. They would, in the Catholic Church, debate various points of doctrine and practice. There were many points addressed in those 95 Theses, not just the issue of justification by faith alone. He also criticized, for example, the sale of indulgences, and he ended up, especially over the course of his later life, coming up with a large variety of critiques of the Catholic Church and suggestions or mandates for reform. Luther's protest against the Catholic Church eventually, over a span of many years, led to his excommunication from the church and then initiated the Protestant Reformation. So the reason why the Protestant Reformation was able to spread was because Luther didn't just debate one-on-one or in writings that got a small circulation, but his ideas were published and spread all throughout Europe because of the printing press. Another set of criticisms that Luther had of the church were of the doctrines of papal supremacy, and in general just of the high amount of authority given to the Pope and other figures in the Catholic hierarchy, like the College of Cardinals, for example. Luther rejected the notion that also priests have this kind of sacramental role in mediating between God and other humans or just faithful Christians. Luther rejected the idea that Christians needed to go to priests to confess their sins, to get absolution and get prescribed penance. Rather, that Christians can go to God directly, and that they don't need to have that role of priest as mediator. And so in Luther, when he ended up eventually starting his own church, the clergy were called ministers of the sacraments rather than priests, technically. So there's just a different view of the role of the priesthood. In the Protestant tradition, as initiated with Luther, they speak of the priesthood of all believers. So everyone who's a believer in God can go to God directly. They don't need to confess their sins to another person and seek penance through that mediating role of the clergy. Luther also had a different view of secular authority than was common in the Catholic Church. He had a pretty robust view of the authority of a secular prince or ruler independent of the church. In other words, he didn't subordinate secular powers to the Pope or any other church official. This was arguably influenced by St. Augustine of Hippo's distinction between the city of man and the city of God. So in Luther's interpretation of that, the city of man, which is secular authorities, in other words, they are a separate power and they don't have to really submit, at least not in a formal sense, to the city of God, which is run by the bishops and clergy on earth. Later in his life, Luther also supported the use of state authority to crush peasant revolts that were happening in parts of Germany. The point is that this aspect of the Protestant Reformation created more of an independent space for secular authority outside of the scope of church jurisdiction. And so practically in the long run, that would lead to less of a religious, ecclesiastical check on the power of state authorities. Another important reformer after Luther was John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564. He was a French Protestant theologian who was initially trained as a lawyer. He became a refugee from France because of his religious beliefs and settled in Geneva, Switzerland, which was an early center of the Reformation. He eventually succeeded in converting the city of Geneva to his version of Protestant Christianity and became the head of government there in 1541. This led to what is known as the Genevan Reformation. John Calvin's Reformed theology included sola fide and sola gratia, like Luther, but also sola scriptura, that the Bible or the Scripture is the primary source for doctrine and practice rather than church tradition or other church authorities like ecumenical councils. John Calvin also had the distinctive belief in predestination. He believed that since the fall of man in the time of Adam and Eve, humans were unable to freely choose perfect saving faith in God. So instead, God predestined some humans to salvation by giving them such salvific faith, and he predestined other humans to damnation. This connected with Calvin's idea that God is all-powerful. So he really emphasized the omnipotence of God over the independent power or agency of human free will. John Calvin also advocated a theocracy style of government, or a government ruled by religious authorities, ruled by the church. Geneva became ruled by Calvin and his followers. The state was also to provide religious instruction for both adults and children. And the church was expected to regulate business and the morals of the community. The disputes between the Reformers and the Catholic Church eventually broke out in violence and warfare. These were the wars of religion. In 1562, for example, there was war between the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, and various French Roman Catholics, because at that time it was illegal in France to be any religion other than Catholic, at least if you're Christian. The Huguenots were persecuted throughout the 17th and parts of the 18th centuries as well. During the 15 and then later the 1600s, many Reformed churches were founded throughout Europe along Calvinist lines, such as the Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And then a third of the early reformers was Ulrich Zwingli, who lived from 1484 to 1531. He was a Roman Catholic priest from Zurich, Switzerland. He was influenced by Erasmus and then by Luther. Erasmus, even though he was also interested in reforming the church, he never broke with the Catholic Church and opposed Luther and all the other reformers who were being disobedient to church authorities. Zwingli clearly rejected papal authority and adopted the doctrine of sola scriptura. He also went beyond the other reformers by rejecting the real presence of God in the Eucharist. Transubstantiation was a term later used for the Catholic doctrine of the real presence in the Eucharist, which is that the substance of the bread and wine become or transformed into the literal body and blood of Jesus. The term consubstantiation is often used for the Lutheran view of the real presence in the Eucharist, but even though Luther's view differed in, you could say, some technical respects from that of the Catholic Church, Luther actually agreed with the Catholics that when you have the ceremony of the Eucharist or Holy Communion, God really is present in the bread and wine. But Zwingli rejected that in 1524, arguing that the Eucharist is just a symbol and that God is not literally present in the bread and wine that's been consecrated. This is known as the view of memorialism, and it was adopted by some other Protestant churches and movements. And so it's worth noting as well that Zwingli's view was different not only from that of the Catholics and Luther, but also that of John Calvin as well. So the Protestants early on started to diverge from each other. Luther actually met with Zwingli to try to iron out some of their differences, but they were unable to do so. So the Protestant Reformation led not just to one Reformed church, but to a whole host of different Reformed churches and movements. In the 16th century, thus, there were several different Protestant denominations. Denominations could be used to refer to the different churches that broke away from the Western or Roman Catholic Church. The Lutherans were followers of Martin Luther. The various Reformed churches were based on the teachings of Calvin, and there were also other more even radical groups like the Anabaptists and the Unitarians. The Anabaptists rejected the long-standing Christian tradition of infant baptism, instead insisting that Christians should only be baptized, i.e., immersed in water, to show their conversion to Jesus as adults when they had reached the age of reason and thus could give their informed consent to do so. The Unitarians rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, i.e., the rulings of the Council of Nicaea and other ancient church councils that defined the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is one being in three persons. Rather, they regarded God as just one person, and they regarded Jesus as the Son of God in some sense and the Messiah, but not actually God. So now a bit more about some of the different Protestant churches and denominations. As mentioned, the various Lutheran churches were followers of Martin Luther. They were prominent in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany, especially in the north, and Scandinavia, so the modern nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And also they spread to parts of the Baltic as well, including the lands that used to be controlled by the Teutonic Knights, or the crusading orders that were active in the Baltic. The Lutheran Church in Germany is known as the Evangelical Church, even though in English the word evangelical has a different context, about which more later. The Eucharist in the Lutheran churches is celebrated in the vernacular or local language rather than in Latin. And as mentioned before, Luther did believe in the real presence of Christ in the elements of the Eucharist, but the Lutheran view is called consubstantiation because they believe that the substance of God is there with the substance of the bread and wine rather than replacing it or transforming it. So that's consubstantiation rather than the Catholic transubstantiation. Lutherans do have clergy, but they permit clergy to marry. They're not required to be celibate, unlike Catholics. Luther ended up ending all of the orders of contemplatives, monks and nuns. He thought that religious life didn't require renunciation of the world, and that rather clergy should be in the world, should have families, should be part of their communities, should not spend their lives in prayer or contemplation. They do have bishops as well in the Lutheran Church, so they retain some of the hierarchy and structure of Catholicism. So Lutheranism became the state religion in some parts of the Holy Roman Empire based on the preferences of particular princes or lords there, and in Scandinavia. And there was more of an integration of the Lutheran Church within the secular government. In modern Germany, for example, tax revenues collected by the federal government continue to support either the Catholic or the Evangelical Church. So in other words, there was an integration that happened in the government apparatus and sort of like the apparatus of the church governance as well. Lutheranism later spread to North America with German and Scandinavian migrants. That was mostly in the 1800s and after. Switzerland was one of the hotbeds of the Reformation, with the reformer John Calvin based in Geneva, Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli originally from Zurich, Switzerland, and the ideas of another reformer, Martin Bucer, who was from Strasbourg, also being influential in the Swiss Reformation. Bucer promoted an active role for lay people as ministers, elders, deacons, and teachers. There were a spectrum of views about the clergy in the Reformation, but all the reformers basically downplayed the necessity of ordained clergy as sacramental mediators between Christians and God, with Bucer on the far end of the spectrum, promoting lay people as people who could take over essentially a lot of the roles of the clergy. The ideas of the Swiss Reformation spread throughout Europe to France, the Netherlands, England, Scotland, and Hungary. The Netherlands was the center of the Dutch Reformation. They were mostly followers of John Calvin. So Calvinists' predestination and other ideas proved popular in the Netherlands. There was also the Dutch reformer Jacobus Arminius. Unlike Calvin, Arminius believed that God's sovereignty was compatible with human free will. The Dordrecht or Dort Assembly in the Netherlands condemned Arminianism in 1518, ending up siding with Calvin instead. Hugo Grotius was a scholar and a jurist, i.e. an expert on the law. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for his Arminianism, and he escaped by shipping himself out in a box of books. So the Dutch Reformation ended up siding with John Calvin. They created the Dutch Reformed Church, which was one of the main Calvinist churches in Europe. The ideas of the Dutch Reformation were brought by migrants to South Africa, to New Amsterdam, the colony that later became known as New York, and later still to Michigan. In England and in Scotland, there were also various followers of Calvin who were Presbyterians. So they believed that the correct ecclesiology or structure of church governance is for lay elders to govern the church in assemblies. This was opposed to Congregationalists, followers of Calvin, who argued for more local control at the level of the church parish or congregation. The Presbyterians did not believe in bishops, so it's these regional assemblies of presbyters or lay elders who are governing the church instead of bishops or other hierarchy. The church in England that became associated with bishops was the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England proper, which was a Protestant church created out of the original English Catholic Church under Henry VIII, about which more later. But the point is, a lot of these reformers were disagreeing with each other, not only about theology, like the theology of the Eucharist, but also about ecclesiology. What is the correct structure of the church? What is the correct model of church governance? So the Episcopalians believed that there should be bishops. The Presbyterians believed in these presbyters or lay elders who govern through assemblies or councils, and the Congregationalists believed in local congregational self-governance. The Scottish Kirk or Church in Scotland became Presbyterian in the 17th century. The English Church didn't, but Presbyterian and other Calvinist reformers remained influential. The Anabaptists were a more radical sect of Protestants who originated around the year 1525, when some of the followers of Zwingli began practicing adult baptism, which was in defiance even of Zwingli himself. The Anabaptists rejected infant baptism. They regarded it as appropriate only for adults who could have rational, informed consent of baptism. Those were the only ones fit to be baptized. They also had even more radical doctrines, advocating, for example, the separation of church and state. They rejected any combination of secular power and authority, unlike the followers of Calvin, who advocated, at least in Geneva itself, an actual theocracy or fusion of the church and the secular authorities. They tended to shun politics and also military service and even the swearing of oaths in courts. Many were pacifists as well, interpreting literally Jesus' principle that a Christian should turn the other cheek if one cheek were struck. The Anabaptists sought to restore an intimate church community that was found, they believed, in the apostolic age. So they tended to radically question many aspects of society and government that they thought of as incompatible with their idealized vision of true Christianity. They also had lay people serve as preachers rather than ordained clergy. They were persecuted in Münster by both Catholic and Protestant authorities after attempting to impose the kingdom of God by force there. The Anabaptists had various subgroupings. The Mennonites were followers of Menno Simons, a Dutch priest. He advocated a nonviolent pacifist form of Anabaptism and for separation from secular authorities. He gained followers in the Netherlands, also in Germany, Austria, and Ukraine. This form of Anabaptism was brought by migrants to Pennsylvania and to Canada, where they became known as the Pennsylvania Dutch by the English colonists who had settled there, Dutch being an old name for German. It later gained the connotation of Low Dutch, Low German, i.e. from the Netherlands specifically, but the Mennonites were from various German-speaking areas. The Old Order Amish, as the North American migrants of Mennonites became known, reject various aspects of modern technology and society as well. The Unitarians reject the doctrine of the Trinity. Martin Solarius argued in Strasbourg in 1527 that God was a single person. So they rejected essentially Jesus as another person of the Trinity, as well as the Holy Spirit as being a separate person in the Godhead. Unitarianism also emerged in Transylvania, Hungary, and in Poland. Later in England, in 1652, John Biddle published Unitarian tracts as well. So the English Unitarianism, while it was surely influenced by what had happened in the continent going back to the 16th century, but socially it was kind of a separate movement. Theophilus Lindsey also established the first Unitarian congregation in London in 1773 and 1774 after he had resigned from the Church of England. And English-speaking Unitarianism was mostly a phenomenon of the late 18th and early 19th centuries under the influence of the Enlightenment, and it also spread to the United States around the same time among some of the Congregationalist ministers and congregations, particularly those that had been associated with the University of Harvard, which eventually became Unitarian. William Ellery Channing was a famous American Unitarian who preached a Unitarian sermon in Baltimore, Maryland in 1819. He claimed that he belonged, quote, not to a sect, but to the community of free minds, unquote. So you can see the Unitarians, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, became very closely aligned with the liberal ideals of the Enlightenment. The picture on the slide is of Ferenc David, who was the founder of the Unitarian Church of Transylvania in Hungary. So there were small pockets of Unitarians in Hungary and some other parts of Eastern and Central Europe as well. Eventually, though, most of the Unitarians died out on the continent, with a few exceptions that survived up until modern times. The reformers of the Protestant Reformation often emphasized the individual believer's relationship with God. And they tended to reject monasticism, ending the role of women as female religious, nuns, and other religious sisters. The convents were generally closed in areas that converted to Protestantism. Some former nuns married. The Protestant churches did allow clergy to marry. This was, of course, something that affected not only nuns, but also monks and other orders of religious in those regions. But it meant effectively the end of clerical and other religious vocations for women. They were not permitted to become priests in the Catholic Church, but it was possible to become a religious sister or a nun, a contemplative, up until the time of the Reformation, where areas that became reformed precluded those possibilities. Martin Luther, for example, who himself had been a friar, not only left the order of Augustinian friars, but also married Catherine von Bora, a former nun. So Luther advocated literacy for both boys and girls so that they could both read the Bible. The Protestants placed great emphasis not only on the scripture as the basis for belief and practice, but also that ideally all Christians should be educated in the scripture. So this did open up new avenues for women with the new ideal of female as well as male literacy. Luther translated the Bible into German as well. This was also an important event in the history of German as a language of literature. This general trend spread throughout Europe. The Protestant reformers believed in using not Latin to study the Bible, but whatever local language was used by the communities. And this eventually spread to the use of non-Latin languages for scholarship of various kinds as well, not just for the Bible or religious literature. The reformers translated the Bible into many vernaculars, oftentimes incurring the wrath of secular authorities. This was illegal in some places without the support of the church or the government. And some reformers supported basic literacy for women as well. The picture on the slide is of Catherine von Bora, who was Luther's wife. Eventually, the Catholic Church responded to the Protestant Reformation with the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation. This was a reform movement in the Catholic Church that had been stimulated by the Protestant Reformation, tried to respond to some of its criticisms, tried to reform the church where necessary, and tried to reconvert some Protestants to Catholicism. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, were an important part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It was founded by Ignatius Loyola, who was a former knight and soldier from a Spanish noble family. He had a conversion experience after being wounded in battle, dedicated himself to protecting the church and promoting Catholicism. And the Jesuits became the most active missionaries for Catholic Christianity in the whole world, not just in Europe. Loyola wrote a very famous book called The Spiritual Exercises that provide spiritual direction, such as techniques of examination of conscience, prayer, and so on. And it became used by a lot of Catholics, both lay people and clergy. The Catholic Church also had an ecumenical council, the Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563. This was the 19th ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, the first since the Council of Constance back in 1417. The Council of Trent reaffirmed and clarified many Catholic doctrines, and it also provided a foundation for the renewal of the Catholic Church. And indeed, some formerly Protestant areas in France and in Central Europe, such as in Bohemia, Moravia, and Hungary, were reconverted to Catholicism during this time. Teresa of Avila was a Spanish Carmelite nun who lived from 1515 to 1582. The Carmelites were a religious order that traced their foundation back to the holy mountain Carmel in the Holy Land, and they regarded earlier prophets and contemplatives of Mount Carmel, such as Elijah from the Old Testament, as being their founders. They were effectively reconstituted during the era of the Crusades, then spread to Europe as well. Teresa of Avila advocated a personal experience of the immediacy of God's presence through divine illumination of the soul through direct experience of God. She had a great reforming zeal and established many new houses within her order, so new places for women to become contemplatives like herself. According to Teresa, mystical experience transforms a person and frees them to exist for God and for others, which can include action in the world. So this was a very kind of dynamic form of mysticism. Teresa wrote The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle. The Way of Perfection describes the bliss of the unitive life, as the soul is joined with God progressively, as being like two candlesticks joining into one flame. The Interior Castle provides an elaborate path toward this unitive state where the soul unites with God, as being like a journey through 7 dwelling places or mansions, the last of which is an interior castle where God resides in the soul. The soul is transformed through its encounter with God. So Teresa of Avila is still one of the most important mystics for the whole Catholic Church. And it does show you that even though women are not allowed to become priests in Catholicism, they've had a very large influence on Catholic spirituality and mysticism through their practice of the contemplative life. John of the Cross, who lived from 1542 to 1591, was another important figure in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. He was a Spanish Carmelite monk and a friend of Teresa of Avila. He and Teresa formed the Discalced Carmelites, or the Carmelites who didn't wear shoes. This was a reform order of the Carmelites intended to restore their original level of asceticism. And he said that he experienced the soul's movement to God as a journey of many stages. So his writings were also very influential on the mysticism and practice of contemplative prayer in the Catholic Church. Contemplative prayer is prayer without words. So it can lead to the state of contemplation where the soul just recollects God, essentially. And that's the closest it's believed the soul can of experiencing union of God and the beatific vision of heaven on earth. It's done through just repetitive focusing, essentially one's intention on God alone. There's different techniques, and a lot of the books of people like John of the Cross and others describe how to attain contemplation. It can also be attained spontaneously, but the long and the short of it is there's a whole theory and set of methodologies of various kinds of prayer and various states of the soul's unification with God that's described in this whole mystical literature of Catholicism, going back to antiquity, like with the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who's kind of one of the main sources of this tradition in his mystical theology and so on. But John of the Cross also famously wrote of the dark night of the soul, which is when the soul longing for God becomes disoriented and loses its way, at least temporarily. So this is painful. It can last for days or for years, but it is a necessary stage on the way to union with God, according to John of the Cross. The English Church had its own Reformation in the 16th century. There had been predecessors to the eventual era of the Reformation, such as under John Wycliffe, who lived from 1320 to 1384. He had critiqued the sale of indulgences and the wealth and power of the papacy back in the 14th century. He wasn't alone. There were other reformers of that time as well, such as the Bohemian Jan Hus, who had a bunch of followers known as Hussites. But their ideas just didn't spread, perhaps because the printing press had not been developed yet. Wycliffe also advocated the use of the vernacular in scripture and in worship, so he organized and promoted a translation of the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate, which was called the Wycliffe Bible. But the Bible, even though it was technically allowed to be translated into various vernacular languages under the Catholic Church, you had to have the church approval in order to do that. So some of these early attempts to translate the Bible without approval resulted in persecution. William Tyndale was another early English reformer. He lived from 1492 to 1536. So this was during the era of the Reformation proper. And he translated the Bible into English from Hebrew and Greek. He was arrested in the Netherlands and put to death as a heretic. Henry VIII was King of England. He lived from 1491 to 1547. He was initially a staunch Catholic who was an opponent of Martin Luther and attacked him and other reformers in a series of pamphlets which also defended the papacy. So it was ironic that he would later break from the Catholic Church. His problem is that he was already married to Catherine of Aragon, and he needed the church's approval, specifically the approval of the Pope in Rome, in order to annul his marriage, i.e. declare it not sacramentally valid. And that was a necessary condition for a Catholic to remarry. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, who he had already fallen in love with in that time, but his real motive for remarriage was so that he could have a male heir, which so far he had been unable to produce through his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon. So Henry eventually declared himself the head of the Church of England. He was influenced by various reformers that were running in his circles. He established the Church of England in 1534. This effectively made it into a Protestant church. Henry seized the property of the church. He dissolved all of the monasteries, again under the influence of the Protestant reformers who were uniformly against Catholic monasticism and various of the religious orders. This happened in England from 1536 to 1540. The monasteries owned large amounts of land. So when he dissolved the smaller monasteries and confiscated their land, he continued onto the larger monasteries, and many of these lands he distributed to his followers in order to ensure their political support, because his break from the Catholic Church had been initially very controversial among the nobility. It was also largely resisted by the people at first, but they were eventually forced by a succession of governments to obey. An example of someone who did not obey was Thomas More, who lived from 1478 to 1535. He was the Lord Chancellor, a very high official serving under King Henry VIII. Because he refused to renounce his Catholic faith and acknowledge the sovereign Henry VIII as head of the Church of England, he was eventually put to death by his former friend Henry. The English Reformation had a series of reforms. It remained more Catholic in terms of its practices, like its liturgy, its clerical vestments, its use of certain icons and things like that than the other Protestant churches. But it did adopt various Protestant ideas as well. This could be seen in the adoption of the Book of Common Prayer in 1549. This became the basis for the new Church of England liturgy. It was Catholic in style, but used the English language for hymns and prayers. Thomas Cranmer was an important reformer from England. He lived from 1489 to 1556. He was appointed the Archbishop of Canterbury. This was the chief cleric in England by Henry VIII, and he was the one who oversaw the production of the Book of Common Prayer. He also served under Edward VI, and he was later burned at the stake by Queen Mary I, who was a Catholic. So Mary I was one of the children of Henry VIII, but she remained Catholic. She never converted to the Church of England. She ruled England from 1553 to 1558, and she succeeded to the throne after the death of Henry's son, Edward VI. Mary was Catholic and briefly returned England to the Catholic Church. Previously, the Protestants had persecuted and killed a lot of the Catholics. It became illegal for Catholic priests to bless the sacrament, lead the Mass in England. So Catholic families would sometimes hide priests in special rooms. They would have masses in secret, etc. Mary basically briefly reversed that. She became known as Bloody Mary by the Protestants because she actually persecuted some of the Protestants in turn, but her rule didn't last that long, and she was the last Catholic monarch of England. She was succeeded by her sister, younger sister Elizabeth I, who was Protestant, and Elizabeth I had a famously long reign from 1558 to 1603. So the approach of Elizabeth was Protestant, but trying to smooth over tensions and trying to make the Church of England something that people could agree to regardless of their religious views. So it became a kind of a compromise. The Elizabethan settlement was based on a series of reforms from 1559 to 1603. And as mentioned, she attempted to make the Church of England a compromise between Catholicism and the more radical forms of Protestantism. So in the Church of England, they just didn't make rulings on certain things, such as whether there's real presence of God in the Eucharist or not. People were free to believe what they wanted based on their conscience, but they had to conform to the same outward acts of liturgy. So they had to go to the same churches, pray the same hymns, etc. That was what Elizabeth ended up demanding, the outward conformity of obedience of the various types of Christians in England to the Church of England, regardless of certain differences of beliefs that were permitted. There's also the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which re-established the Church of England's independence from Rome, and Elizabeth was granted the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which was retained by her successors. In other words, in England, the king or sovereign was regarded as the head of the church, not the Pope in Rome. The Puritans were one of various groups of dissenters who rejected the Church of England. So there were many Protestants who thought that the Church of England was still too Catholic for their taste. For example, it still had bishops and a kind of church hierarchy, and a lot of the liturgy had the style and flavor of Catholicism, even though they had changed the language from Latin to English. And so many Protestants were unhappy with the Church of England and continued to protest against it as well. These various groups were known as dissenters. The Puritans were Calvinist dissenters who sought to further reform and purification of the Church of England. Even though they were a minority in England, they had a lot of political and economic power. They tended to come from the middle classes around London and other parts of central England. The Puritans had a variety of critiques of the Church of England. They didn't like the church ornamentation, the elaborate clerical vestments worn by the priests, the use of organ music, and the retention of the sign of the cross and other gestures, which they all associated with Catholicism. They emphasized themselves preaching over the sacraments as being important and strict observance of the Sunday Sabbath. They emphasized scriptural authority versus that of the clergy, church, or tradition. As mentioned, the Church of England, even though it was Protestant, it retained more of the Catholic traditions than the other Protestant churches, like a lot of the festivals, making the sign of the cross, doing certain types of worship. Like they basically retained the same format of the Catholic Eucharist and the liturgy, just essentially translating it into English and so on. The Puritans also believed in predestination, like John Calvin, for salvation or damnation, respectively. And they asserted the church's authority over the state versus the Church of England, which was subordinate to the king. Many of the Puritans ended up fleeing England to go to the English colonies in North America, known as New England. And they became very influential on establishing colonies there and the later culture of New England and eventually of the United States when that was established in the following centuries. The Quakers were another more radical Protestant group in England. They didn't get started until later in the 17th century. The Quakers was their nickname. They were officially known as the Religious Society of Friends. They were founded by followers of the preacher George Fox, who lived from 1624 to 1691. During the English Civil War, which had broken out between Parliament and the Crown or the monarchy, Fox was a dissenter who advocated Christian pacifism. He traveled the countryside and preached, stripping Christianity of clergy, ceremonies, church buildings, and even festivals. So they were a very radical form of Protestantism. Protestants in general tend to strip away forms or aspects of Catholic Christianity they thought of as non-biblical or as not being part of their perceived original or pure Christianity. In this regard, they were kind of like early antecedents of the modern fundamentalist movements, but the Quakers were especially kind of extreme in that regard. They had meeting houses where instead of having a liturgy of the Eucharist, they would just sit in silence until the Spirit moved them and someone would speak. They were nicknamed Quakers because they would shake when filled with the Holy Spirit. They refused to pay tithes or taxes to support the Church of England. They refused to take legal oaths or to serve in the military, so they were often persecuted in England. They also thought that mysticism or union of the soul with God is only meaningful if it furthers service to others in the world, i.e. it doesn't have its own intrinsic spiritual value. Because they were persecuted a lot in England, many of them traveled to the New World, and especially in the colony of Pennsylvania, which was named after William Penn. William Penn lived from 1644 to 1718, and Pennsylvania, i.e. Penn's Woods, was a large tract of, at that time, unsettled, mostly uninhabited land. There were some Indian tribes living there as well, but it was lightly populated, and so a lot of the Quakers moved there and established a strong influence on the culture and law and government and society of the Pennsylvania colony. So Pennsylvania was one of the English colonies in the New World, and all of these colonies, at least on paper, owed allegiance to England, but they didn't have the same controls on religion as in England itself. So a lot of the various dissenting groups ended up migrating across the Atlantic from England to North America. The Congregationalists were other English reformers. They originated in some separatist clergy in the time of Elizabeth I, but they came to prominence during and after the English Civil War. In the time of Oliver Cromwell, Cromwell became the leader of the parliamentarians after they got their victory over the loyalists who were followers of the king. The parliamentarians essentially advocated for greater authority politically for Parliament rather than for the King of England. And the parliamentarians were mostly Puritans, unlike the supporters of the king who were either Catholic or Church of England. But the Congregationalists were Calvinist Puritans who disagreed with Presbyterian Calvinists about ecclesiology. The Congregationalists did not believe in assemblies of presbyters or elders to govern the church, so a kind of collective level governance at the level of the region. Rather, the Congregationalists believed in each congregation or church community, i.e., the particular people that meet in a particular church building or location every Sunday. They are the ones that should be the ultimate authority in their own theology and governance. So it's a highly local, highly dispersed, also highly kind of democratic, you might say, or participatory form of church governance. So they were considered among the radicals that were not welcome in the Church of England. So many of them also fled to the English colonies in the New World. There were Congregationalists in New England. They founded Harvard University in 1637 and later Yale University in 1701. The Harvard Congregationalists, many of them eventually became Unitarian later in the late 1700s. They also formed the Congregational Union in England in 1832, kind of uniting the various different scattered strands of Congregationalism together. The Baptists were another kind of more radical English Protestant group. The English Baptists practiced adult baptism like the Anabaptists of continental Europe, but they were more closely tied to the English Puritan movement. They didn't have antecedents or contacts with the continental Anabaptists. They believed that people should consent to their religion and that the individual's choice should be private and not subject to state authority. So, of course, they came into conflict with the Church of England and the various governments of England that were trying to impose the Church of England on everyone. There was a split within the Baptists in the 1640s and after in England between the particular and the general Baptists. The particular Baptists were Calvinist, and they believed that redemption is reserved for a particular segment of humanity, whereas the general Baptists believed that redemption is at least potentially for humanity as a whole, and it's up to each individual to decide whether they will be saved or not. In America, the American Baptist churches were founded in the American colonies, the English colonies in North America, basically, in 1639 and after. But they only became prominent in the New World during the First Great Awakening. This was in the earlier half of the 18th century. It was one of the earlier evangelical revivals, about which more later. And eventually the majority of American blacks became Baptists. Baptists are still the largest denomination of Christians in the United States. The picture on the slide is of John Smith, one of the founders of English baptism, who lived from 1554 to 1612. The Pietists were a movement among European Protestants, including German Lutherans and Dutch Reformed churches, starting in the late 1600s and flourishing in the earlier 1700s. The Pietists emphasized a spontaneous renewal of faith with a feeling of certainty of divine forgiveness over various doctrinal disputes that had exercised the Protestant denominations previously, such as disagreements between Arminianism and Calvinism with regards to predestination, or the various competing doctrines of ecclesiology, such as Congregationalism or Presbyterianism. They were emphasizing the sincerity of faith and emotion. Pietism spread among the Lutherans of Europe and later to America. The Moravian Brethren, this was an older group, also known as the United Brethren. They traced their origins back to that 14th and early 15th century reformer from the Kingdom of Bohemia named Jan Hus. He was ethnically Czech. That's the people who, they're West Slavic people who live in Bohemia and Moravia, and that was sort of its own separate kingdom back then within the Holy Roman Empire. But he was an early reformer. He actually had a lot of the same ideas as the later Protestant reformers, but his ideas became more focused just in Bohemia. This is before the invention of the printing press. So that was one of the reasons why the ideas didn't spread. But there were people who were followers of Hus that remained and continued through the Protestant Reformation, and they later moved to Germany, Saxony, to escape persecution. But they ended up later on influencing the Wesleyan movement, named after John Wesley, a preacher in England, and his movement became known as Methodism, and eventually separated from the Church of England. This was in the first half of the 18th century, but they're worth mentioning here because their approach to Christianity, although influenced by the Moravian Brethren, was also very similar in tone to that of Pietism. So Wesley emphasized the importance of the personal subjective conversion experience, and the sort of sincerity of faith and the kind of outpouring of emotion connected to faith in Jesus and the conversion experience and so on. So we'll talk about that more later when we get to the First Great Awakening. In terms of the Protestant Reformation, there were a lot of changes to the role of the clergy and the pattern of worship. Reformers such as Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin generally opposed the mediating role of the clergy. They believed that all baptized Christians had direct access to God and do not need clergy to mediate, such as through offering the forgiveness of sins. And they tended to downplay the sacraments as well. Even those who believed in the real presence of God in the Eucharist, the liturgy of the Eucharist, that part of church worship, tended to become less important than the liturgy of the Word, i.e., preaching the gospel. The clergy became ministers of the sacraments rather than sacramentally ordained priests who served the kind of vital function in mediating people's relationship with God. There were very many liturgical reforms in the Protestants. Most Protestants opposed the use of icons of various types, so they would often destroy statues or paintings in churches, paint over murals. You can see the picture on the slide of a Dutch Reformed church that previously had been, a very large Gothic style church, and the walls are just bare white, and they would have stripped away a lot of the crosses and other decorations, stripped away the stained glass windows, just replaced them with plain glass, leaded glass, etc. The Protestants also tended to advocate full congregational participation in liturgical music, so like the whole congregation sings the hymns, for example, not just a choir. The frequency of communion actually increased during the Protestant Reformation, but the clergy and the congregation would both share in the bread and wine. In Calvinist churches, there was less of a separation between the clergy and the congregation than was retained in the Lutheran churches. The altars were often removed from the wall or decentered or replaced altogether with a movable communion table. So they reinterpreted the Eucharist, instead of being more of a sacrifice of Jesus to God the Father through the Holy Spirit, it became more of a shared meal, ritual meal that was enjoyed by the congregation. So that was kind of a change both in the theology of the Eucharist, but also in how it was celebrated, essentially becoming a bit less ritualistic, a bit less formal. And in many Protestant churches today, they don't have the Eucharist with every church service. It can be given kind of intermittently or sporadically. So now we're going to talk about Christianity in the modern era, essentially the last several hundred years leading up to the present day. The Protestant Reformation resulted in a series of wars between Protestants and Catholics across Europe. These religious wars were exemplified in the 16th century by the wars between the French Huguenots or Calvinists and the Catholic monarchy. They culminated in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. These were a series of wars, many of them fought across the Holy Roman Empire, i.e. Central Europe. Between Protestants and Catholics, the emperor was Catholic, as were some of the leading princes or nobles, and there were other princes in the empire that were Protestant. But there were other alliances as well. So, for example, the King of France, although Catholic, like the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he was an enemy of the Holy Roman Emperor. The King of France was one of the chief rivals to the emperor as far as Christian monarchs in Europe. And so France fought against the emperor rather than for, even though they were also Catholic. Eventually, in 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, there was an end to the fighting. The Holy Roman Empire, including Germany, was exhausted. It took decades or centuries to recover. A lot of cities were destroyed and lost population and so on. Other powers were involved. In addition to France, there was Sweden, for example, had armies fighting in Europe at the time as part of the 30 Years' War. But eventually, the principle of cuius regio et ius religio was recognized. That was one of the things that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The basic principle is that the prince or the sovereign of a given realm or state, uh, cuius regio, that's his the region, that person would get to decide what the religion of the territory should be, i.e., et ius religio, his the religion. So the Europe basically divided along denominational lines, but the fighting between Catholics and Protestants tended to stop. There was a kind of status quo or modus vivendi that was established in which the state essentially got to choose the religion for all of the subjects in a given population. Later in the 17th century, there were some political philosophers such as John Locke and others who were liberals in the sense that they argued for individual choice among subjects as to their religion. That was still a controversial idea in the 17th century. Most people, regardless of whether they were Catholic or Protestant, thought that all subjects of the same state needed to have the same religion in order for them to be part of the same society. But nevertheless, after the religious wars ended, there was a kind of practical accommodation between Catholics and Protestants, although they continued to hate each other or have a lot of fraught relations. Practically speaking, they were no longer fighting for one another's existence, and that led to a kind of de facto toleration of the existence of other religions, and eventually, within the next century or two, this would result in the idea of freedom of religion. Also during the 17th century, though, was the development of the new science. This is part of the Age of Reason, as it's called by later scholars. The new science was basically philosophy of nature that was based on the scientific or experimental method. So there's a lot of ways we can characterize the scientific method, but having true experiments is one of them, where the scientists would manipulate the manipulate things that they were observing to try to control for various factors to determine the actual cause-effect relationship between things. And the new science didn't just include true experiments like Galileo's rolling balls down inclined wooden planes to measure their acceleration force, but also just careful observations like of astronomical phenomena and creating mathematical models to try to account for the observations. So there were several innovations, but one of the big ones was just combining mathematics with natural philosophy, which ancient Greek and just traditional medieval natural philosophy hadn't done. The traditional natural philosophy gave qualitative descriptions of things like the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, and their characteristic principles of motion, which, according to Aristotle, earth and water, for example, move down, air and fire move up, but there's no precise mathematical models that lead to testable predictions that you can test against observations or sense data. So the new science developed combining mathematics of algebra. They developed new forms of math as well, like the calculus, to help precisely model physical systems. And this proved to be hugely beneficial. This led to actual progress, understanding the natural laws, the principles that govern nature. So an example of an early member of the new science movement was Nicholas Copernicus, who proposed a heliocentric or sun-centered model of the universe in 1543. The Catholic Church had proscribed Copernicus's book in 1633, so it remained quite controversial. The Catholic Church was invested in the old science or the traditional natural philosophy rooted in ancient Greek works, such as those of Plato, Aristotle, and the astronomer Ptolemy. But eventually these ideas were accepted after a lot of vigorous debates among scholars. And I already mentioned Galileo Galilei. He was one of the astronomers, but he also did physics, and he was found guilty of heresy by the Inquisition. People were not usually charged by the Inquisition for their scientific beliefs, but the scientists would occasionally also challenge church doctrines, and the Inquisition had the authority to get people to force people to change their minds if they had said something heretical. But in the long run, the new science proved very influential, and there was much questioning of traditional philosophy, but also of theology and religion. So most people involved in the new science, they were Christians, whether Protestants or Catholics. They weren't atheists, at least not publicly or openly. There may have been some who had their doubts or who were deists, so deists believe in God, but they don't believe in miracles, and they don't typically believe things like Jesus is the Messiah or things like that. But most people in the new science were at least publicly Christian. But the point is, by challenging church traditions and just traditional scholarship, I mean, going back to ancient Greek pagan philosophy about the way the natural world works, they got people wondering, they got people questioning things, and that included a move away from traditional sources of knowledge, including religion as well as natural philosophy. The Enlightenment was a cultural movement among many philosophers, writers, artists, government officials, rulers, just the wealthy classes in general, and other cultural elites that really got going in the 18th century. So it was kind of subsequent to the new science, which originated in the 17th century, but was a broader cultural movement that included people who were proponents of the new science. But in addition to being fans of science as a way of generating knowledge about reality, the Enlightenment had new political ideas as well. So this was the origin of political liberalism, as it being known today, included a constellation of different political principles, and there was considerable diversity of belief even among members of the Enlightenment. But many of them shared an interest in things such as liberty, the idea that you could have a stable social order while granting individuals a significant amount of liberty. That was considered very controversial or radical or counterintuitive at the time. Most people had the intuition that social order depends on a hierarchy and submission to authority. But the philosophers and others involved in the Enlightenment often talked about individual liberty, including freedom of speech, freedom of choice of religion, and other principles like that. They believed in equality under the law, many of them, so that there shouldn't be different laws governing nobles versus common people, for example. One of the third of the rallying cries of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity refers to universal brotherhood of humans, i.e. not dividing along social class or even among denomination or sect, but rather just regarding others as equally human, rational animals is how people often thought of humans in the Enlightenment. But people could find a kind of universal brotherhood of man on that basis. Some people in the Enlightenment also believed in limited government, so the idea that the power of the government should be limited, that if it becomes excessive, it can actually be used to abuse or tyrannize the people. And some people in the Enlightenment also advocated various forms of representative government, not necessarily full democracy, which was still considered quite radical at the time, but the idea that the people should have some formal mechanism for letting their wishes or preferences known that is reflected in the political power structure, such as a parliament or assembly of some kind. The Enlightenment era of the 18th century also saw the origin of secularism, i.e., a general name for an ideology that doesn't prioritize religion in terms of belief and value and practice. The idea that religion, if it should be there, should only govern a small sphere of life, and that much, if not the majority of life, should be dedicated to worldly concerns, such as security of persons and property, pursuit of wealth, and worldly happiness. The Enlightenment led to many critiques of traditional forms of Christianity, as well as spawning some new forms of Christianity as well. Part of the Enlightenment movement was the social movement known as Freemasonry. This sort of descended from medieval Masonic guilds. Stonemasons were people who were some of the most skilled craftsmen in the Middle Ages. They worked on the large churches, including the cathedrals or places where the bishops would have their seats. But the Freemasonry was not really welded or rooted that much in the craft tradition per se. It was more of a social club where people could use some of the symbolism and ritual apparatus of actual Masons, but they were doing it for a philosophical or a spiritual or a political purpose. The Freemasons advocated a belief in God, but they thought of God as a kind of master architect or designer of the physical universe. But they thought of God as a kind of remote governor, not someone who intervenes miraculously, and they downplayed the role of Jesus. Freemasonry talks about God or the designer or the architect, but it doesn't talk about Jesus and Christianity much. They argued for a brotherhood of all human men and for a lot of political liberal ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity. So Freemasonry, it was obviously later connected to a lot of conspiracy theories. In part, this is because the Freemasons were enemies of the Catholic Church. They were enemies of a lot of the monarchies of Europe at the time. So they had political and religious ideas that would have been considered radical or revolutionary. And so there's probably some truth to the idea in a general sense that they conspired, against the Catholic Church or against the traditional systems of government like monarchy and aristocracy, but they functioned, practically speaking, in a more simple way. They were social clubs. They were places for people to gather, to share ideas, to gain new social bonds across social classes in society. And functionally, they spread the ideas of the Enlightenment to the various upper and middle classes that tended to join the Freemason lodges. They only allowed men, not women, to become members, but they allowed men of all social classes and all denominations. Because they were so anti-Catholic, a lot of Catholics wouldn't join them, but Catholics and Jews and others were permitted, at least in principle. Um, so they also used a lot of ritual, and there's different interpretations of this, but they were trying to use ritual, among other things, to bind their members together and to sort of give them a sense that what they were involved in was special and important and connected to kind of like the mysteries of the cosmos somehow. So a lot of people who were interested in the new science, the Enlightenment, wanted to reform society, introduce new political values. A lot of people joined Freemasonry for those reasons, or they joined Freemasonry as a social club and then came to adopt that ideology after having done so. So a bit about deism. Deism was one of the main theologies that was promoted by a lot of the key figures of the Enlightenment. Deists believe in a supreme God who's the creator and designer of the universe. But and according to deism, the designer of the universe, i.e. God, doesn't uh, create miracles. God creates and rules the universe through natural laws or regularities, which are rational principles that basically govern the motions and operations of matter. And so they believe that it would be irrational for God to create these laws, these principles to govern the universe, and to violate his own laws through miracles. So deism was a kind of rational alternative to Christianity. And there were a lot of key figures of the Enlightenment, such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, perhaps even George Washington, who were either deists or at least sympathetic with deism. I give the examples from the American context for a couple of reasons. One, the founding fathers of the United States were deep into the Enlightenment cultural movement, but also just as an illustration of how Enlightenment ideas really led to actual political and cultural change. And probably the Freemason lodges in the U.S. may have partly been responsible for coordinating and organizing the American Revolution against the British Crown, although they also apparently did some organizing in like coffee houses and I believe at least some taverns and things like that as well. The deists were not the originators or the sole proponents of the teleological argument, but they were a salient example of people who used this argument to prove God's existence. Teleological means of or related to a purpose or theory of the purpose, and it's connected to the purpose of the universe, where the purpose is that appear to exist in the universe. So it's an argument for God's existence based on the appearance of order, purpose, or design and complexity in the world. And oftentimes, people who make the teleological argument, there's different versions of it, just like other arguments for God, like the ontological argument, have different versions. But they often point to biological organisms as examples of very complex structures that exist in nature that seem like they must have been designed by an intelligent being, and a being of very great intelligence and very great power. So it's supposed to be evidence for God's existence. A famous example of the teleological argument from the Enlightenment was provided by William Paley. He was a British minister, and he wrote a book called Natural Theology in 1802. He used an analogy of a watchmaker. So he compared the universe to a large complex mechanism with the appearance of order and function. And he said that just as a watchmaker could be inferred from the existence of a watch, which has a complexity of moving interconnected parts which are clearly serving some function, Paley argued that an intelligent designer, i.e. God, could be inferred from the existence of the universe with its own corresponding complexity and appearance of order and function. Many figures in the Enlightenment were deists, but they are also often skeptical of traditional forms of Christianity. So deists were generally, even if they went to church and were nominally Christian, secretly or maybe just not so secretly, they were theists, or people who believed in God, but not really believers in things like the divinity of Christ and so on. But most people in the Enlightenment, they just continued to be Catholics or Protestant Christians of various types. But there was kind of like a subtle shift in emphasis, you might say, in the broader culture towards more secular ways of thinking. So a bit about the philosophy of the Enlightenment. To a certain extent, again, this was operating in parallel with Christianity. So a lot of the key philosophers throughout the Enlightenment period were themselves Christians of various kinds. Like Descartes, for example, was Catholic. Um, Kant was at least nominally Lutheran. He was really influenced by the Pietist tradition, specifically when he was younger. His family was Pietist. But it's likely that at least some of these philosophers abandoned their Christianity, probably usually not publicly, but maybe privately. But even when they didn't abandon their Christianity, they were giving kind of like new rational, new types of foundations for their beliefs. So a lot of these philosophers of the Enlightenment sought new types of rational arguments, either of the existence of God or the immortality of the soul or things like that. So they're at least questioning and trying to reform, revise, or replace traditional church teachings on the matter. So epistemology is theory of knowledge, and the Enlightenment philosophers were divided about what they thought of knowledge. Some of the main camps were rationalism, empiricism, and skepticism. The rationalists, they also had internal disagreements, but what they agreed on is that at least some knowledge is not based on sense experience, but rather based on pure reason. So just the human mind using reason to figure out what is true and what is false. So salient examples of knowledge that appear to operate like this are mathematical knowledge. Like there's no empirical observation, nothing you can see or hear or touch or whatever that proves that 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's true just based on the meanings of the terms, or you could say the concepts involved. So examples of rationalist philosophers, Spinoza, Descartes, and Leibniz. Descartes was Catholic, Leibniz was Protestant. Spinoza was actually a Dutch Jew of Portuguese descent, although he ended up being excommunicated from his Jewish community in the Netherlands because he was considered heretical in his beliefs. He was basically just a philosopher who developed his own philosophical worldview, not based on Judaism or some other religion. The empiricists, their theory of knowledge is that all knowledge comes from sense experience, or possibly including some other types of experience as well, like internal experience, like introspection. But examples of empiricists included John Locke in England, Berkeley in Ireland, Hume, who was from Scotland originally, and Adam Smith, who was also a Scottish philosopher. And there were also skeptics, people who doubted all knowledge or knowledge of certain kinds. Hume is given as a famous example of this, even though he was an empiricist, so he believed that there is some knowledge and it's based on sense experience. He thought that there were a lot of instances of alleged knowledge that people thought they had that were actually not real knowledge. So, for example, knowledge of cause and effect, Hume thought was not based on a rational argument. So even though he thought you could know certain things, about the world, it was really just based on your particular observations. And when you try to make generalizations about cause, effect, regularities in nature, you're actually extrapolating beyond what the sense data tell you. So he was skeptical about cause, effect knowledge. And he was also a skeptic about the existence of God as well. In terms of metaphysics or theory of being and reality, there were, again, a variety of views. There were dualists like Descartes who argued that matter is one type of substance and mind or soul is a fundamentally different type of substance with its own nature. Descartes also used this to help argue for the existence of the soul after the death of the body. So he was a Catholic Christian, at least nominally, but he came up with radically new arguments to try to defend principles of the faith, like the existence of God based on his version of the ontological argument, and the immortality of the soul based on his account of dualism. Idealists were people who believed that mind is the fundamental reality, not matter. So there were only a few of these, but they did exist, like the German philosopher Leibniz, who had a kind of semi-idealistic interpretation of substances or the fundamental beings, which he called monads. He basically thought of the fundamental beings as being kind of like atoms in the metaphysical sense of something that has an essential unity to it. It cannot be split or divided into proper parts, but that these things have a logical structure. Today we might spell this out in terms of the information content using maybe concepts from computer science or something like that. But that was Leibniz. He actually invented the idea of the computer, but it was the 1600s, so it would be a while before any such things would be built. But it's not entirely a stretch. In other words, to use a kind of like computational model for trying to explain or interpret what Leibniz was saying with this idea of the monads and their internal rational structure. But the point is, they were defined in terms of a rational structure or an information architecture, you might say, rather than in terms of their material substance. Berkeley was an idealist who lived in Ireland. So Berkeley was an interesting case because he was an empiricist, but he thought that you couldn't prove using sense experience that matter exists, and so it's more reasonable to just assert that only mind exists and that that's the fundamental reality. But many people in the Enlightenment were also materialists, people who thought that only matter or possibly other types of physical energy. Nowadays, people often use the word physicalism for this philosophy because it, strictly speaking, doesn't just believe in matter. It also believes in other types of physical stuff like light energy or whatever. But back in the 1700s, it was common just to regard all physical things as being material in some sense. So they called this philosophy materialism. Hume is an example of someone who appears to be a materialist. He's skeptical about the existence of the soul or anything that's a non-material substance. And this idea wasn't originating with Hume, so you can even see apparent precursors of it going back to, for example, the 17th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who in many of the passages of his Leviathan sounds very much like a mechanistic materialist. Mechanistic materialist is someone who thinks that everything that exists is made of matter, but also that anything that happens, any event, you can analyze in terms of the change of the state of matter, typically through motion of matter. So it's as if the universe is just a giant material machine, analogous perhaps to a watch or a giant clock that has these complex array of parts, but that are just moving in a material sense, and that's accounting for everything happening in nature. And that was a very common and increasingly common view throughout the Enlightenment because of the new science and its kind of very mechanistic understanding of nature. So the reason why we're going through all this stuff, even though it doesn't relate directly to Christianity, it should be clear, at least by implication, that this materialist or other views of the universe are quite out of line with traditional Christian views of things, where you have immaterial beings like God and the angels and or human souls, depending on the Christian, that are existing within material universe and can have causal power outside of it. There's a much more kind of rich array of metaphysical beings and states in the traditional Christian worldview, but a lot of that is being challenged throughout the Enlightenment. So David Hume was one of the early people to express in print form skepticism about the existence of God. He did so in a book of his called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Although he didn't come out directly arguing for atheism in that book, it was framed as a debate or dialogue between people with different views, and it wasn't published until after his death. However, it was generally agreed upon by people who knew him and his critics that he was actually an atheist, even if he wasn't open about it. So he was an early example of someone who argued for atheism or something like it. Immanuel Kant was another philosopher of the Enlightenment. He lived from 1724 to 1804. And even though he believed in God, he critiqued the traditional arguments for the existence of God. So he read Hume and actually agreed with a lot of Hume's critiques of those arguments. But Kant tried to come up with new arguments he called transcendental to prove things like the existence of God, the existence of the soul, and things like afterlife and divine judgment. Just as an example of one of his criticisms of the traditional argument for God, he argued that the ontological argument fails in part because existence is not a predicate. And basically that means, according to the ontological argument, at least one version of it, God, his essence or nature is a being that fundamentally exists. So some people use this to try to argue that from the very idea or nature of what it means to be God, you can prove that God must actually exist because the essence or nature of God is existence. But Kant thought that this made existence or real being into a predicate or property that you could either attribute or not attribute to a substance. But he thought that doesn't really work, that existence is not like predicates or properties, it's something else altogether. And so there's some type of logical error going on here when you try to say that God or anything else for that matter could exist by having that as a property that's necessarily part of its nature. Like an example that Kant might give to illustrate this sort of thing is that you could have a concept of a triangle, like an equilateral triangle that has 3 equal sides, 3 equal angles, etc. You can add other properties as well, define it all you want geometrically, but you cannot also have as one of its properties in your conception of it actual existence. That it's always a separate question whether it really exists in the world, and it's not something you can prove or know or define purely conceptually or theoretically. Kant also argued that causality, like cause-effect relations in nature, are not known through sense perception. So he agreed with Hume on that. But he did think it's part of the structure of thought through which sense perception is and must be interpreted. So he used this also in part of his critique of the cosmological argument, which is a third type of argument for the existence of God that argues that the universe must have a first cause, and that first cause must be God. So it's too much, would take us too far afield to discuss Kant's actual arguments for God's existence, but the point is, he agreed with Hume and a lot of other of the arch skeptics of the Enlightenment about the deficiencies of traditional arguments for God, but nevertheless, he was still trying to provide an alternative set of arguments for things like God, the soul, and divine judgment. After the Enlightenment of the 18th century, there were a series of other ideological and cultural movements that sort of stemmed out of the Enlightenment but also challenged aspects of it. What these had in common is they similarly tended to challenge and undermine traditional forms of Christianity. Romanticism was a movement that grew out of the Enlightenment starting in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It emphasized emotion, sincerity, spontaneity, the free play of the imagination, creative genius, and the distinctive spirit of each individual or each people. Like the Enlightenment, it tended to value political ideals of liberty and equality and solidarity or brotherhood, but with the Romantics, they thought that each nation or people had its own genius or essence that made them distinctive. And so they opposed the Enlightenment idea of a kind of universal toleration in which every nation might have the same political system. So, for example, in the French Revolution, the late 1700s, there was an idea that all nations might have a similar government based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the leaders of the Romantic movement, many of whom were in Germany, thought that the German nation or folk had its own spirit, its own nature, its own essence, and what worked for the French wouldn't and couldn't work for the Germans. That's just one aspect of the Romantic movement. National identity wasn't always most salient. They also prioritized things like mystery and the supernatural and the occult and the mysterious and the unusual, rather than the Enlightenment ideal of reason and sense experience being able to discover the fundamental nature of reality and kind of bring light to the whole universe. The Romantics kind of created a mystique of darkness and diversity and difference. There was also the idealist philosophy that emerged in Germany and elsewhere in Europe after the time of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, you could say, was the last great figure of the Enlightenment in terms of philosophers, but he also initiated post-Enlightenment, post-Kantian idealist forms of philosophy. Kant was trying to split the difference between empiricism and rationalism, and perhaps between physicalism and other types of metaphysical theories as well. He emphasized mind as a structuring principle of reality and gave it relative priority over material substance. For Kant, there's a logical structure to our experience that is both an epistemological and ultimately as well a metaphysical fact. The idealists tended to hold up the idea of the mind structuring reality and interpret it as mind being a more fundamental thing than physical reality. This is highlighting the logical, the rational structure of the universe or of our experience of phenomena. Hegel was an example of someone who emerged out of this tradition, and he talked about a logical structure of history itself, a dialectic or back and forth between opposing rational principles that works itself out in history through time, rather than just at a particular moment. Friedrich Schleiermacher, who lived from 1768 to 1834, was a founder of liberal Protestant Christianity. So he's an example of someone who's influenced by the Enlightenment, by the Romantics, by post-Kantian idealist philosophy, and he uses those ideologies and movements to inform his interpretation of Christianity. He characterized religion as, quote, an intuitive sense of absolute dependence, unquote. So he's highlighting the intuitive or subjective experience of religion, and he's maintaining that that subjective aspect of the experience at the very least remains even if there were no rational proof of the existence of God, for example. Schleiermacher's theory of the atonement was that Christ functions as a moral exemplar for humans, rather than, for example, his sacrifice on the cross being a substitute for human sin. There's different theories of the atonement that different types of Christians, whether Catholic or the various types of Protestants, advocate. But what's noteworthy about Schleiermacher's theory of the atonement, this moral exemplar theory, is that it highlights the role of Christ in the mind, the imagination, or the subjective awareness of the believer, rather than in objective or metaphysical facts. For Schleiermacher, salvation comes first as a subjective change in a person's spiritual awareness, and atonement then follows as a kind of divine human reconciliation. So in other words, the more liberal types of Protestant theologians were interpreting religion more in terms of its subjective impact on the believer than trying to make sort of claims about the ultimate structure of reality. There were many challenges to Christianity from modern science as the 19th century progressed as well. The founders of the new science, even though they did have theories that conflicted with traditional religious or just cultural views, like the earth being the center of the universe and so on, they tended to not use their theories to try to reject Christianity per se, but there were more attacks on Christianity and also just on Christian understandings of history, like the account of creation in the book of Genesis, for example. The early 19th century science tended to actually be creationist. The creationism is the view that every species, every biological species on Earth, like plants, animals, etc., was created by God, basically in accordance with the story told in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. But by the 19th century, early 19th century, geology, as it was developing under Lyell and others, suggested the Earth was much older than the account given in the Bible, that it was many millions or billions of years old. And some natural philosophers had also begun to propose by the early 19th century that species evolved gradually in nature. This was actually an ancient view that had been suggested by some ancient Greek philosophers as well, but the evolutionary way of thinking where organisms with complexity and intricate structure develop out of more simple organisms from previous generations, rather than being deliberately designed in their fully realized complex state directly by God. This general thinking of gradualism in geology and evolutionism in biology culminated in Charles Darwin, who wrote his book on the origin of species in 1859. Darwin argued that species of organisms evolved primarily by natural selection and were not directly designed or created by God. There are other mechanisms of evolution too that were believed in both by Darwin and by later evolutionary biologists, but natural selection was the one he highlighted, where organisms that have any traits that help them survive and reproduce better have an increased ability to survive and reproduce. So it's as if nature selects, not deliberately or consciously, but indirectly nature does select certain organisms for survival, and thus because the organisms that do survive and reproduce can have average traits that are different from those of the population as a whole of their generation, the traits that are inherited by their descendants, and thus the average traits in succeeding generations of the population can change gradually over time. But Darwin and other biologists thought you could actually build up complexity through many, many waves, many, many generations of natural selection operating on organisms. And if you give large amounts of time, as the 19th century geology seemed to suggest did exist, like billions of years, then it seemed as if you could have complex organisms, all kinds of plants, animals, and ultimately humans themselves, arising out of these purely naturalistic processes and not through an act of deliberate divine design. And then in 1871, Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, argued that humans too evolved from ape-like ancestors, and that modern apes and humans have a common ancestor. In other words, arguing that humans are not an exception to evolution by natural selection, but fit into this larger structure that all living organisms share. So evolution, geological gradualism, and also astronomy, which suggested the universe had an age and scale that was far different from that traditionally believed in Christianity and other religions. All of these challenged biblical narratives and decentered humanity in the cosmos. Again, disrupting the biblical narrative of the universe essentially being created for the sake of Adam and Eve and thus their human descendants. Rather, humans are just one type of organism living on one planet in one star out of a vast sea of billions of stars. The Enlightenment and various post-Enlightenment political philosophies often challenged or de-emphasized the Catholic Church and or all of Christianity. So I mentioned the political ideals of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, fraternity. These saw fruit in the American Revolution, which lasted from around 1765 to 1783. A lot of these slogans of the revolutionaries, these were Americans in the English colonies in North America who were rebelling against the rule of the English king, but also Parliament that, at least on paper, ruled the colonies back from London. But the revolutionaries wanted to create their own government, and they believed in extensive liberties for all of the subjects of a government, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and so on. They believed in equality under the law as opposed to having aristocracies with inherited wealth and privilege. They believed in representative government, written constitutions, and various other principles too, which came out of Enlightenment era political thinking. The French Revolution started in France in 1789 and lasted until 1799, but its ideas were quickly exported throughout the continent, such as through the conquests of Napoleon. But this was a very radical shift. The French revolutionaries, they wanted to destroy the power of the Catholic Church, but also the kings and the aristocracy in France. They ended what's called the Ancien Regime, or the old regime, the feudal system of government that had been in France since time immemorial. They suppressed the Catholic Church, stripping Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris of many of its icons, for example, damaging it, seizing church property. Many of the clergy were put to death. It was actually a bit harsher on the Catholic Church than a lot of people remember it today. A lot of people just have kind of vague, fond memories of the French Revolution as a time of putting the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity before the public, but it was actually had a very specifically anti-Christian and anti-Catholic flair to it, and there's a lot of violence against clergy in France. They even created, the revolutionaries at one point created a cult of reason in the capital, where they created like an idol of the goddess of reason. So they were actually, to a certain extent, trying to replace Catholicism with rational religions or pseudo-religions. The revolution was eventually put to an end and Napoleon took over, but it had lasting political effects, not only in France, but also throughout all of Europe and eventually all the world. So Napoleon Bonaparte ruled France from 1799 to 1814 and briefly again in 1815. He emerged in the French Revolutionary Army. He was of common birth, but he was an able strategist and leader. And he ended up taking control first of the military and then of the entire regime. He was a fan of the ideals of the French Revolution, but he thought that the revolution had spiraled into chaos. By then, there was the terror, so a lot of revolutionaries were putting political enemies to death, including first the King and Queen of France, other aristocrats, but then other revolutionaries as well. It degenerated into political violence, chaos, disorder. Napoleon created a stable dictatorship out of this mess. And he did promote the ideals of the Enlightenment. So there were new legal codes he promulgated that had equality under the law, various other political ideals inspired by the French Revolution, which he did impose on the various lands he conquered and forced alliances with throughout Europe. France in the 18th century had been the largest, most powerful kingdom, had the largest population, and that was used by the revolutionaries and then by Napoleon to help make them the strongest military power. They became an imperial power. They had a united nation, a united army that had large civilian participation in mass conscription. So it created the first modern nation state with a military that for a while was unchecked until Napoleon was defeated by an alliance of enemies in 1814 and then again in 1815. So partly during this process of the 19th century, there were many new forms of government and legal codes established throughout Europe. Republics and constitutional monarchies replaced some of the traditional monarchies. A lot of those traditional monarchies and aristocracies and other traditional social institutions and customs were weakened or destroyed. And a lot of these had supported the church or different churches in different lands and traditional forms of Christianity. With their destruction, a lot of the, not all of it, but some of the support for Catholicism and other Christian denominations declined throughout Europe. And the governments tended to become secularized republics that didn't provide official support, protection, or regulation of the church. Religion became an individual choice for the citizens of the various regimes. And this process continued in 1848, in which various revolutions throughout the capitals of Europe broke out, and these were inspired by kind of new forms of the ideals of the Enlightenment of the late 18th century. As well, during the modern period, this going back to the 15 and 1600s and continuing all the way up into the 1800s, there were just a large number of social and economic changes happening that also transformed and weakened the role of Christianity over culture and the life of the nation, you might say. So the economic changes began with the commercial revolution, which is basically long distance, large scale trade and banking. There were also joint stock corporations developed and proliferated in the 1600s. These were ways of pooling capital that was possessed by diverse individuals to create larger scale investments. Like a lot of the English colonies in the New World, for example, were created through joint stock corporations because it would be difficult for a given individual, or even in some cases, kings or other powerful individuals, to provide the capital needed to start various complex business ventures. And it was also a way of sharing the risk by having people pool together their assets. So if there was a failure, it wouldn't necessarily fall disproportionately on one key investor. By the way, the early colonies in England and most other places that were joint stock corporations, they failed. They weren't actually profitable. There probably were a few exceptions, but what was significant was this new form of corporation that allowed new forms of business and investment, and over the long run, this proved to be very profitable and productive. So we get the beginnings of global trade and finance. The Europeans by now are exploring all around the world. They're opening up trade networks to India and China and elsewhere, the New World. They're planting crops in the New World like sugar and tobacco that can't be grown in Europe, and they're consuming those, but they're also trading them. So also in the late 1700s, especially progressing throughout the 1800s, is the Industrial Revolution, replacing handcrafted tools and other items with mass-produced, machine-produced textiles, tools, modern steel smelting technologies. There's a lot is going on. The society, the economy is getting more complex, more industrial, more advanced. So there's a transformation by the 1800s from what had been an agrarian, manorial, village economy to urbanization, private property as opposed to like village commons and the like, and a currency-based economy and society with large-scale industry. Many people migrated from the rural areas to the cities to work in factories and such like. With all these economic and social transformations came various social changes. There was, to a large degree, a breakdown of traditional village communities with their extended families and customs. The conditions of the industrial workers led to the labor movement and political agitation as people demanded things like safer working conditions, shorter working hours, days off, etc. Socialism and other radical political ideologies spread among the educated elites and eventually among the urban workers as well. Socialism, there are different kinds of it, but it tended to advocate for government ownership of capital or the means of production. And instead of having private individuals or even joint stock corporations owning the means of production and profiting off them disproportionately, the idea was that these would be government owned, and then the government has some kind of regime in place to share the profits among the workers or the people generally. Did not tend to happen in terms of actual practice, but that was the ideology that spread among a lot of the workers' movements in the 1800s. And socialism, as well as many of the other more progressive ideologies that were developing in the 1800s, tended to be atheist or secular. There were some Christian forms of them as well, but socialism, practically speaking, as well as communism, tended to spread atheist ideology. During the Enlightenment, there were also religious reawakenings called the Great Awakenings. So the Great Awakenings were a series of Protestant evangelical revivals in which the gospel was preached anew and many people came to faith or renewed their faith in Jesus. The first Great Awakening started in the 1730s and 40s. It happened mainly in Europe, especially England, and in British North America. So this was spinning off from the reforms of John Wesley, the Methodist. Members of the First Great Awakening encouraged Christians to receive the Holy Spirit, proclaim the gospel, and express God's love in the world. And there was also a theological split, however, between the Calvinist and Arminian theologians that continued into this time. The Second Great Awakening started around 1800 in Britain and then also spread to the New World shortly thereafter. It focused on missionary activity, so bringing non-believers around the world to Christianity. This is the first great wave of Protestant missionary activity. The Third Great Awakening started in the second half of the 19th century and continued in the early 20th century. So it saw Protestant missionary activity around the world, including East Asia like China, Korea, and also in Africa, but also emphasized social engagement and a greater role for lay people in Christian society and various types of social reforms, like the Prohibition movement that wanted to end the legal consumption of alcohol. So John Wesley, I mentioned him a couple of times. He was an English Protestant reformer who lived in the 18th century, 1703 to 1791. He started out as an Anglican priest, i.e. a priest in the Church of England, but he formed a study group at Oxford that had other members such as Charles Wesley and George Whitefield. They were nicknamed the Methodists because they methodically studied thinkers such as Jeremy Taylor, who was a 17th century priest. They encountered a group of Moravians from Germany, the Moravian Brethren, on a ship back from the colony of Georgia in the New World. The Moravians, by that time, had been influenced by Lutheran pietism, and they advocated a lively, heartfelt faith that had a large impact on John Wesley and his peers. So he had an experience wherein his heart was strangely warmed, and he wanted others to have a similar experience with the living Christ. In terms of his theology, Wesley rejected Calvinist predestination, and he advocated Arminianism, the view that all who believed are saved by grace, but that their will is not preordained or predestined by God. He also advocated the doctrine of sanctification, that all who are saved by faith should continue to grow in sanctity or holiness as evidence of their actual salvation, and that this should manifest in outward works of charity. So kind of modifying the traditional Protestant doctrine of sola fide, or by faith alone. This doctrine of sanctification, by the way, is accepted by a lot of modern evangelicals and other Protestants today. The Methodist Church grew out of Wesley's view of Christianity. He did not originally intend to split with the Church of England, but it became obvious that his Methodism was not welcome within the church, and so eventually his followers formed their own church, the Methodist Church. They put emphasis on teaching the gospel, having involvement of lay people, and missionary work, as well as Wesley's doctrine of progressive sanctification. In the New World, Jonathan Edwards was a part of the First Great Awakening. He lived from 1703 to 1758. He was an American Calvinist with Puritan roots. So he believed in Calvinist predestination, that only some are chosen by God to be saved, and only God knows who. His most famous sermon today, anyway, is Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, which he wrote in 1741. It emphasizes the fact that we're all potentially bound for hell, and it's just through God's will and grace that we may avoid that faith. So it's supposed to put a kind of fear of God in the Christians who hear it. Edwards' writings remained popular throughout the 19th century, and they influenced later the Third Great Awakening and the later evangelical movement as well. As the 19th century progressed, the Methodist churches in America gradually lost their evangelical fervor and became more conventional. The holiness movement was a 19th century revival that emphasized the importance of the conversion experience in which a Christian soul turns to Jesus, and in which the gift of holiness or progressive sanctification was received. New holiness churches were founded by converts from various mainline Protestant denominations. And in the Great Awakenings of the 19th century in the United States, there was a prominent role played by African Americans as well. So you can see an example, a picture on the slide, Julia A.J. Foote, who was an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which took part in this holiness movement in the 19th century. The revivalists, i.e. those participating in the Great Awakenings, often emphasized the participation of lay people in the life of the church, including women. Most of the revivalist preachers were male, but most of the people who attended their tent revival meetings were in fact female. And that's also partly one of the reasons why a lot of the early supporters of Prohibition, which a lot of the revivalists thought of alcohol as a great scourge on society because it led to drunkenness, abuse of wives, domestic violence, various forms of not working, laziness, joblessness, all kinds of social dysfunctions. That's one of the reasons why they were advocates of prohibition, but a lot of the people in that movement were also disproportionately female. Women formed many volunteer organizations for social causes, not just supporting prohibition. The Sunday school movement may have been one of the most important. So this was a movement to provide education for working class children on Sundays. So they would learn the Bible, but they also become literate and could sort of become more productive, more skilled members of society. There are various missionary societies in which women worked. The temperance movement, i.e., advocating for prohibition, that was a big part of it as well. And there was also a partial revival of the order of deaconesses, which kind of stemmed from the early church in the first and second centuries AD, when women played certain roles that were regarded as unsuitable to be performed by men, such as preparing women for baptism. But this was revived by some of the Protestant women lay people as part of these evangelical revivals. There was also the new occupation of paid employment for women working in church ministries, not as ordained ministers, but in various staff positions in churches. And I mentioned the missionary aspect of these Great Awakenings. Before the Second Great Awakening, i.e., before the early 19th century, most missionaries were Catholic, such as the Jesuits, who spread Catholic Christianity in parts of Asia and other parts of the world. But the Catholic missionary work began to decline in the early 19th century, and correspondingly, Protestant missionary activity was starting to increase at that time. William Carey lived from 1761 to 1834, and he was an Englishman. He founded the Baptist Missionary Society in England. He traveled to India in 1793 to help spread Protestant forms of Christianity there. These were various Protestant missionary groups, some run by different denominations, but they had certain common characteristics. They tended to focus on teaching the gospel, translating the Bible into local languages, and training indigenous clergy to take up their role after them. And they tended to regard other religions, such as Hinduism or what have you, as works of the devil. The Third Great Awakening later in the 19th century also involved re-evangelization and Christianization of Western societies, some of which had already begun to secularize by that time. And the colonial governments, such as in British India and elsewhere, often combined missionary work with assimilating of indigenous cultures to Western values and ideas. There were various theological controversies and denominational splittings happening in the modern era as well. Christians reacted differently to the development of modern science, the new types of criticism of the Bible in terms of biblical scholarship, and various political ideologies emerging in the 19th century, like socialism. Liberalism or modernism, in the context of the church, means those who change Christian beliefs to make them fit modern science, biblical criticism, such as regarding certain biblical stories as myths, and modern political values, such as democracy or liberalism or egalitarianism. Evangelicals or evangelicalism is a continuation of the revivalist movement, and modern evangelicalism in the 20th and 21st centuries ultimately stems from the Third Great Awakening and after. And then there's fundamentalism, which is a general tendency, you could say, to reject modern science, modern political values, and so on whenever they conflict with the Bible or traditional Christian teachings. So fundamentalists tend to reject the theory of evolution, the idea of modern geology that the world is billions of years old, etc. And they'll have a literal interpretation of the creation story in the book of Genesis, for example. But they'll also reject oftentimes feminism or other modern political values or ideologies that are regarded as conflicting with traditional Christian teachings. The picture on the slide is from a modern evangelical megachurch, Hillsong Church in Los Angeles, California, but it's just illustrating the continued relevance of this evangelical form of Christianity today. So I mentioned biblical criticism. What is that? Historical biblical criticism interprets the Bible based on its historical context. It studies the Bible as a historical document rather than assuming it's a divinely revealed scripture. Modernists or liberals generally accept historical biblical criticism of the Bible. One aspect of a theory that emerges out of historical biblical criticism, which really got started in the 19th century, including among a lot of German scholars, but this was the documentary hypothesis. This posits that the Torah, i.e. the 5 books attributed to Moses traditionally, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, was composed of 4 different sources that were later redacted or edited together. The modern version of the documentary hypothesis, which you can see in diagram form on the slide, is more complicated than that, but what it has in common with the original form of the documentary hypothesis is that the Bible is a composite text, including even the Torah, or the part traditionally attributed to the prophet Moses. And so there's different layers that were kind of edited together by later priests or scribes. Historical biblical criticism also generally rejects biblical inerrancy. Biblical inerrancy is the view that everything the Bible says is true. It's not the same as biblical literalism. which is the view that the Bible should always be interpreted literally, not figuratively or allegorically, etc. But some people accept both doctrines. So in other words, this is significant. Among other things, people who accept the documentary hypothesis are denying divine authorship of the Bible. They're even denying that one inspired prophet like Moses created it, and they tend to see it as a kind of patchwork compilation of different texts that were kind of edited together. For example, they tend to regard the author of the first creation story in Genesis chapter 1 as a different source or author from the second creation story in Genesis chapter 2. There were many 19th century scholars who wrote biographies of Jesus that were shorn of supernatural elements, interpreting him as a historical figure rather than assuming he was God, the Messiah, or the Son of God per se. This was part of the larger growth of science and scientific type of scholarship in the 19th century, including social sciences like economics, sociology, and you could say historiography. Albert Schweitzer was a German theologian and humanist who lived from 1875 to 1965. He condemned, however, what he called the, quote, quest for the historical Jesus, unquote. He regarded those 19th century biographies of Jesus as making him out in a way that would just conform to modern liberal ideas. He called them liberal lives of Jesus. The Gospels, he said, portrayed Jesus as an apocalyptic figure far removed from modern ways of thinking. You can see this quest for the historical Jesus as well later in the 20th century. In the late 20th century, the so-called Jesus Seminar, for example, attempted to create new historical analyses of the life of Jesus, trying to identify, for example, which parts of the Bible the scholars thought were actually said by Jesus and which parts they thought were added by later Christians. I mean, a lot of this is very kind of like speculative, and scholars, even coming from a secular perspective, can have disagreements about the proper methodology for uncovering the historical Jesus, from the religious and other sources. But it gives you just the general sense that there were people within the Western Christian societies who were effectively breaking away from Christian ideology and coming up with more neutral historical or social sciences attempts to understand Jesus and Christianity itself. Evangelicalism should be distinguished from fundamentalism, although they can overlap as well. Both were opposed to modernism. Both were also broad cultural movements with considerable overlap and also considerable internal variation. Evangelicalism emerged out of that tradition of the Great Awakenings, those Protestant revival movements. They emphasized the importance of the conversion experience in which a person turns their life over to Jesus and regards Jesus as their personal savior. They tended to have Wesley's doctrine of sanctification, where after salvation through faith, you would become progressively more sanctified, and that would issue forth in works of charity that were publicly verifiable. They thought of divine grace as enabling an overflowing in works of charity. They also tended to emphasize lay leadership in the church rather than ministers or other ordained clergy. They really prized scripture first and foremost. They were not always biblical inerrantists or literalists, but they often were. And this was nothing new. This is kind of like a continuation of the older Protestant tradition of sola scriptura. But if anything, scripture is even more central to evangelicalism. It's not literally true that they worship scripture as if it were an idol, but it's kind of like, even though it's not literally true, it kind of approximates their fervor, their faith, and love of scripture. And they also emphasize preaching the gospel, both to non-Christians, but also Christians who kind of lapse from the faith. The picture on the slide is of Billy Graham, who's one of the most famous evangelical preachers in the United States in the 20th century. So evangelical Christianity is one of the most common influential types today, now not only in the United States, but also all around the world. But there's also fundamentalism. This movement started in the early 20th century in North America, United States, and Canada. The fundamentalists rejected evolution, historical biblical criticism, and any other aspect of modern science or society they thought of as conflicting with traditional Christian beliefs or values. The movement met in Niagara, the so-called Niagara Conference, and they agreed on 5 points of fundamentals. This was published in a series of tracts in 1909 and after subsequently. But the 5 fundamentals were: 1, biblical inerrancy; 2, the divinity of Jesus; 3, the virgin birth. So in other words, they are agreeing with some of the traditional doctrines of Nicene Christianity. 4, substitutionary theory of atonement. That's the theory that Jesus saves people by substituting for their punishment, that divine justice requires humans be punished for their sins, but because we lack the ability to save ourselves in that regard, Jesus takes the heat for us. He sacrifices himself to satisfy divine justice, but in our place so that we can be saved. And we can effectively get the salvation through faith in Jesus, but it's the fact that Jesus is substituted, he's punished in our place. That's what's doing the literal saving work. And then five, the fifth point of fundamental is the physical resurrection and second coming of Christ. So the fundamentals, these gave the name to the movement of fundamentalism, and they were 12 tracts published in 1909 and after. They were authored by a variety of prominent evangelicals. So the fundamentalist movement is emerging out of American evangelical Christianity. The reason why I make a distinction between them is not all evangelicals accepted all the 5 points of fundamentals. So you could say even though there's a lot of overlap between the two movements, they're not strictly identical. The fundamentalists became distributed throughout the Anglophone or English-speaking world, and nowadays fundamentalist Christianity can be found worldwide. Pentecostalism is a Protestant Christian movement that emphasizes experiencing the Holy Spirit and its gifts or charisms. It's named after Pentecost, the feast on the 50th day after Easter, which commemorates the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles, as described in the book of Acts in the Christian New Testament. The apostles received charisms such as glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, the ability to heal through divine grace, and the gift of prophecy, among many others. There were a variety of people in the United States in the 19th century who started the Pentecostal movement. Charles Parham was an influential figure. He lived from 1873 to 1929. He was an American evangelist who taught that speaking in tongues is evidence of baptism of the Spirit. William J. Seymour lived from 1870 to 1922. He was a student of Charles Parham. You can see his picture on the slide. He preached the imminent return of Jesus to various mixed-race crowds in Los Angeles in 1906 as part of his Azusa Street revival. The Pentecostals were noteworthy among American Christians in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were one of the few to have integrated or mixed-race congregations and followers. A variety of Pentecostal denominations or churches were founded in the late 19th and early 20th century, such as the Assemblies of God in 1911, the Church of God in 1886, and later the Pentecostal World Fellowship in 1947. Nowadays, Pentecostalism is the most rapidly growing form of Christianity in the world. Amy Semple McPherson was also an important person in the Pentecostal movement. She lived from 1890 to 1944. In Pentecostal Christianity, women can become preachers and leaders if it's believed that they are gifted by the Holy Spirit. So McPherson, she used the radio to help spread Pentecostal beliefs and gather a very large following. Later, Pentecostal evangelists often used television and other media. McPherson built the Angels Temple in Los Angeles, which was an early megachurch. So Los Angeles, even though it doesn't have a huge reputation nowadays as a center of Pentecostal or evangelical Christianity, historically speaking, it has been. She founded the Foursquare Gospel Church. However, her career was later on marked by controversy. She disappeared from Venice Beach and later reappeared in Mexico in 1926, and she was accused by some of faking her own abduction and of having extramarital affairs. It is a matter of public record that she had, I believe, 4 different husbands. Global Pentecostalism is one of the main factors of Christianity today. As I mentioned, Pentecostalism is the fastest growing type of Christianity in the world. More than 25% of the world's 2 billion Christians identify as Pentecostal or charismatic. Global Pentecostalism often emphasizes divine healings as well as speaking in tongues, exorcisms of demons, and prophecy. Pentecostal churches often also function as community centers. The picture on the slide is from a Nigerian Pentecostal church in Africa. The social gospel was a concept developed by Walter Rauschenbusch, who lived from 1861 to 1918. He regarded Christianity as a revolutionary ideology, and he interpreted the kingdom of God as not about getting to heaven, but as transforming life on earth. So he focused on social sins, so-called, such as religious bigotry, graft, and corruption. So he's using Christianity and the gospel to try to reform society politically and socially. Rauschenbusch's social gospel concept influenced Christians of many types in North America. In the United States, the social gospel movement often sided with labor against big business. In Canada, the social gospel movement encouraged business owners to treat their workers fairly. Tommy Douglas, who lived from 1904 to 1986, was a Canadian Baptist minister. He became a politician and later promoted socialized medicine in Saskatchewan based on social gospel teachings. There are many types of liberal theology in the modern and now postmodern eras. Even though they're all equally liberal and you could say modernist, so they oppose traditional forms of Christianity, there is a lot of internal diversity of ideology as well. Existentialist theology was developed by Paul Tillich, who lived from 1886 to 1965. Existentialism is difficult to define in brief, but it's a form of philosophy that, among other things, will sometimes use the slogan, existence precedes essence, i.e. that human beings exist in reality before they have a essence or nature, and that humans lack a fixed essence or nature, that humans are characterized by free will, so that humans are free to create their own being, their own nature, through their acts of willing, through their choice. That was a formulation that would be developed by Sartre and 20th century French existentialists, but there were precursors of existentialism going back to the late 19th century, like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and so on. But the point is, there were some liberal theologians in the 20th century, such as Tillich, who were influenced by these various forms of existentialist philosophy and brought it into their Christian theology. So here's an instructive quote from Tillich. Quote, God is being itself in the sense of the power of being or the power to conquer non-being, unquote. This is from his Systematic Theology, Volume 2. What's significant there is he's using the dialectic of metaphysics of being and becoming, of essence versus existence, and trying to use that to spell out Christian theology. Process theology was based on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who lived from 1861 to 1947. He thought of God, like other beings, as being a metaphysical process rather than a substance with a fixed nature, and that process develops or unfolds over time in relationship with the unfolding universe. Christian socialism also developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. It combines Christianity with socialist ideology, so it sees in the gospel, with its social justice message of Jesus blessing the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized, tries to combine that with modern socialist political ideology, which advocates for state ownership of the means of production and division of the profits equally among the workers or the members of society generally. And it provides a Christian critique of capitalism. Liberation theology developed later in the mid to late 20th century, and it combines Marxist class analysis specifically with Catholic Christianity. So it developed in Latin America among people who were partially identifying as communists, but they also still wanted to identify as Catholic Christians. And they later incorporated other oppressed groups, not just the working class or proletariat, into their ideology, such as women, indigenous people, people of color, etc. So this is an example of the larger expansion of Marxist class analysis into various types of oppression dynamics that occurred under postmodern philosophy in the late 20th century and under the so-called quote-unquote woke ideologies of the early 21st century as well. Women had a changing place in Christianity in the 20th century. Traditionally, women were not allowed to become priests or clergy in Catholic, Orthodox, and in many Protestant denominations of Christianity. In Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, it's believed women cannot become priests because of the liturgical role the priest serves at the sacrifice in persona Christi. That is, the priest is taking on the role of Christ when Christ offered himself up on the cross to God the Father, mediated by the Holy Spirit. The priest is ceremonially taking that role when he offers the host, the bread and wine, up to God. And it's regarded as necessary that the priest be male in order to perform that in persona Christi function. Women also formerly lacked voting rights in the governing bodies of many Protestant churches. After women were given voting rights in Protestant governing bodies, many Protestant denominations also began permitting female clergy. So an example of this, the Episcopal Church, their first woman bishop, Barbara Harris, was ordained in 1989. You can see her picture on the slide. Before then, the Anglican Church of Canada, which is part of the same Anglican communion as the Episcopal Church of the United States, they're all ultimately descending from the Church of England. But the Anglican Church of Canada allowed the ordination of women deacons, priests, and bishops since 1976. The Church of England itself allowed ordination of women bishops since 2014, with Libby Lane being the first to be so ordained. And the province of Central Africa, however, which is in the Anglican Communion, refuses to ordain women. And this is a pattern that has been repeated many times in the 20th and early 21st century. A lot of the more liberal progressive forms are coming from Western societies. And in cases where the churches or denominations exist around the world, often other cultures don't share modern Western liberal or progressive values, and they often resist these various reforms, such as ordination of females to the clergy or to the bishophood. The Catholic worker movement and Dorothy Day were also important elements of progressive Christianity in the 20th century. Dorothy Day lived from 1897 to 1980. She was a journalist and a political activist and member of the Communist Party who had a conversion experience. She remained a Marxist in terms of her political ideology, but she became a Catholic Christian. She founded the Catholic worker movement along with Peter Morin, and they advocated social justice based on the gospel, especially hospitality for the marginalized. She created houses of hospitality where workers lived alongside people who needed food and shelter. The workers be mentioned here are workers who were working for the Catholic Church for spreading the gospel. She also founded the newspaper Catholic Worker, which was advocating the ideas of the Catholic worker movement. She advocated for pacifism and anarchism, but along Christian lines. There were also various 20th century movements for social change in the United States and around the world outside the Catholic Church. In South Africa, they had an apartheid system of state-enforced racial segregation between blacks and whites. Apartheid is from the Afrikaner word for segregation, or apartness, literally, aparthood. The Afrikaner Party won an election in 1948. They were the ones who made apartheid the official ideology of the state after that election victory. The Dutch Reformed Church, which was the main Protestant church in South Africa, supported apartheid. The Anglican Church of South Africa, however, under Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a black African, opposed apartheid. And so they formed a really important religious opposition to apartheid. And Tutu was one of the key voices that helped undermine apartheid, especially later in the 20th century. In Latin America, there's a movement called Comunidades de Base. These were grassroots Christian so-called base communities that formed in Latin American slums. They were often supported by local priests, but they were controversial in the church because they were often advocating Marxist and communist ideology, which a lot of Catholics regarded as incompatible with Christianity or Catholicism. In the U.S., the civil rights movement was often led by clergy. The black churches provided a leadership and organization role in protest against racial segregation throughout the southern United States. The most famous example, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who himself was a Protestant minister, and he also was a political organizer and leader of the civil rights movement. And there were other participation of various religious groups as well, various Protestant churches and others active in the civil rights movement in the United States. Vatican II was an important moment in the history of the Catholic Church. This is a short name of a Second Vatican Council that met from 1962 to 1963. It was convened by Pope John XXIII, who reigned as Pope from 1958 to 1963, who called for an aggiornamento, or updating, of Catholicism to meet the modern times. There were many changes to the Catholic Church that came out of the Vatican II Council. Some of these were called for by the council itself. Others, including a lot of the details of the change to the liturgy, kind of grew after the council as the council ideas were implemented. So they were kind of decided on or encouraged later by the various elements in the church controlling the liturgy. But there were radical changes to the Catholic liturgy and a variety of practices and just the internal culture of the church as well. For example, traditional vestments for priests were often modernized, simplified, or wholly dispensed with, as were habits for contemplatives, monks, and nuns. There were many lessened requirements for fasting, such as not having to abstain from flesh or meat every Friday, and fewer days of abstinence and fasting during the season of Lent. They removed communion rails and traditional icons and ornaments from many altars and sanctuaries. The intention of a lot of these changes was to make the church seem more open and modern, but in terms of its actual effects, unfortunately, a lot of Catholics just stopped going to Mass, stopped attending, stopped participating in the religion in the 1960s. It's not entirely clear, at least if just based on superficial view, that this was due to Vatican II itself. It might have been people just getting more lukewarm in their faith or something like that. But that's a controversial view within Catholicism. It's also possible that the lack of religious participation that happened in the Catholic Church in the 60s and 70s was just part of the larger secularization of society that was happening in the United States and the rest of the Western world during the countercultural movement, civil rights movement, and other political and cultural changes happening in the 1960s. But the new order of the Mass, or Novus Ordo Missae, as it was known, was one of the important things that came after the Second Vatican Council. So the traditional Latin Mass, or TLM, was largely replaced in the 1960s and 70s. Latin was replaced with English, Spanish, and other vernacular or common local languages. But that was not the only change. The way that the priest would perform the liturgy of the Eucharist changed from facing the altar, or ad orientem, to facing the congregation, or versus populum. They were trying to bring the Eucharist to the people rather than make it primarily an offering to God. There were changes such as altar servers being allowed to dispense the host, not just consecrated clergy like priests or deacons, communion in the hand as opposed to on the tongue, etc. Many, many changes. The look of the altar was changed. The altar might be taken off the back wall, placed into deeper into the nave, made into a kind of table for a ceremonial meal. Many, many things. Overall, the Catholic liturgy became more Protestant looking throughout this process. Now, there are still Catholics who practice the traditional Latin Mass, and there's various forms of the Novus Ordo Missae. They allow a lot of variation, so some are actually more traditional, others are more of a modernist or reformist bent. Despite the more liberal modernist approach to the Catholic Church that was celebrated by the Second Vatican Council, or promoted by the Second Vatican Council, and continued to be promoted in the 1960s, 70s, and after, Pope Paul VI, who reigned from 1963 to 1978, surprised some people with his issuing of the document Humanae Vitae in 1968, which prohibited the use of artificial birth control by Catholics. Prior to the 20th century, most Christian churches had condemned birth control, but by that time, many Protestant denominations had allowed various forms of birth control, and it was widely expected in the media that the Catholic Church might do so as well. But with the document Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI made it clear that that was not going to be the Catholic position. There's been tension in the Catholic Church, however, at least since Vatican II, between reform-minded modernists and traditionalists of various stripes. So an example of this tension and conflict can be seen in the Catholic Church continuing to reject the remarriage of divorced persons from being recognized by the Church, as do some Protestants and Eastern Orthodox Christians. They do accept the remarriage of divorced persons. That continued rejection is opposed by the modernists, but it's supported by the traditionalists. And there's a lot of other splits as well, such as whether to change the Church's stance on homosexuality, and a variety of other issues. John Paul II was Pope from 1978 to 2005. He was perhaps best characterized as a moderate. In some ways, he was a traditionalist, but he also did not challenge any of the reforms of Vatican II or of the post-Vatican II era reforms to the liturgy. He was from Poland originally, and he had tensions with various communist Eastern Bloc nations because the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, which had been sponsored by the Soviet Union after the Second World War ended in 1945, they suppressed Catholicism and other forms of Christianity and religion. And he had come into conflict with the communist authorities in Poland in the past. He opposed capital punishment, however, so this became a more common view in the Catholic Church. Throughout its history, actually, the Catholic Church, like most traditional Christian churches, thought that the death penalty or capital punishment, like for murder and other serious crimes, was perfectly justified. But that started to change in the late 20th century. There are people who argued that the culture of life, for example, which was represented in the Catholic Church's opposition to the practice of abortion. That should also include opposition to the death penalty. He opposed apartheid in South Africa, so he was involved in some progressive political causes. He condemned some aspects of liberation theology, however. So again, he's kind of a moderate in that he's not going along with all of the progressive or modernist proposals and reforms and ideology. He's supporting some of them, but not all of them. He also authored a series of documents that are collectively called Theology of the Body. They were subsequently published in a book under that title as well, where he's trying to articulate from a traditional Catholic perspective the nature of men and women, gender roles, sexuality, and things like that. That's actually come into more prominence recently because of the controversies in the church and in the broader society about the transgender movement and so on. There was a sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church beginning in around 2001. The scandal was involving abuse of children by clergy going back to the post-World War II era, and sometimes continuing up until what was then the present day. And the scandal was also that there was a cover-up, and some of the clergy were not kicked out of the church, they were just hidden and reassigned. And so the church had a long track record of covering up and refusing to take responsibility for sexual abuse of minors. There are thousands of civil lawsuits that have been filed against the church coming out of that scandal, seeking compensation for damages. This has posed a lot of financial constraints on the church. So, for example, in the United States, there were 8 different dioceses or church administrative districts that declared bankruptcy between 2004 and 2011. Benedict XVI was Pope from 2005 to 2013. He was a conservative theologian who had worked closely with John Paul II previously. He was the first Pope to resign as well, since Gregory XII had resigned in 1415, doing so to end the Great Western Schism between Rome and Avignon. So that led to the papacy of Francis I, Pope Francis I, who's currently still Pope as of the time of this recording. So he's reigned as Pope from 2013 to the present day. Francis is much more of a liberal and a modernist reformer. He's called for ending the traditional Latin Mass. Previously, it was tolerated to varying degrees. So if priests or others wanted to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, they were allowed to. But recently, Francis has tried to crack down on that, believing that it's no longer compatible with the modern ideas in the church post-Vatican II and so on. He's also called for allowing priests to bless unions of same-sex couples, ordaining female deacons. The latter has not happened yet, but Francis has advocated for it. And he's also advocated for the so-called synodal way, which is having a greater role for synods or church councils in governing the church, and also providing a role for lay people in the synods, not just bishops or other clergy. All of these things have been very controversial. There's been increased conflict between modernists and traditionalists in the church. Ironically, despite the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass by Francis, there's actually been a revival of interest in the traditional Latin Mass and traditional forms of both Catholic and Orthodox spirituality in recent years. Maybe it's kind of like a reaction against various types of progressive ideologies. But right now, the institutional apparatus of the church, most of the hierarchy is aligned with Francis, with some exceptions. But bishops who have opposed Francis, like Bishop Strickland, for example, who used to be bishop in Tyler, Texas, some of them have been removed. Like Strickland was removed from office by Pope Francis. And so there's just kind of this low-level but persistent conflict and a kind of like warfare in the church between the traditionalists and the modernists. Francis and most of the hierarchy is modernist, though. But the traditionalists, they have a kind of groundswell of support, so the future is kind of unclear as far as the Catholic Church is concerned anyway. The ecumenical movement was also very important in the 20th century. This was a movement for cooperation between different Christian churches. It actually started in Protestant churches as early back as the late 19th, early 20th century, largely as they were kind of coordinating in missionary work. So the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1910 had denominations of various Protestant churches dividing the world into territories between them to avoid competition and redundancy for converts to Christianity. So this was an early example of ecumenical cooperation between different churches, albeit in this case of Protestant ones specifically. There was also the Student Christian Movement, which was an interdenominational Christian youth work organization that developed in the 20th century, and the Federal Council of Churches. These were various churches in the United States that collaborated on policy issues. And then finally, the World Council of Churches was formed in 1948. That saw participation by Protestant and Orthodox churches as well. You can see the picture on the slide of various delegates from the World Council of Churches meeting with President John F. Kennedy in 1963. There were also, as part of the ecumenical movement, some denominational mergers. A lot of the historical causes for the splitting of different denominations, including, relatively obscure points of theology and ecclesiology and so on, were less salient for people in the 20th century. So this led to some of them being remerged together. The United Church of Canada, the UCC, was formed in 1925 out of Canadian Methodist, Congregationalist, and Presbyterians. The Uniting Church in Australia was formed in 1977 by the Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church, and Congregational Union of Australia. The United Reformed Church was founded in 1972 out of English Presbyterians and Congregationalists. However, it must be noted, during each of these mergers, there were generally some congregations that refused to participate, and so they effectively led to new rounds of splitting into different smaller and smaller denominations as well. As far as the Catholic Church goes, it also engaged in some ecumenical work in the late 20th and early 21st century. The Catholic Church became much more favorable towards ecumenism after Vatican II. The Oriental Orthodox churches, such as the Egyptian Coptic Church, entered into dialogue with the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, for example, and they made some progress. But unfortunately, that progress appears to have been largely undone as of the time of this recording. After Pope Francis issued the document Fiducia Supplicans, that was the recent document that permitted priests to bless same-sex unions, which is considered very inappropriate and incorrect, or heretical basically, by the Egyptian Coptic Church and other Oriental Orthodox churches. You can see the picture on the slide of Pope Francis meeting with Pope Tawadros II, the then head of the Egyptian Coptic Church, in 2013. That spirit of ecumenical cooperation no longer currently exists because of Fiducia Supplicans. Currently, the Catholic Church is still the largest Christian church. You can see the map on the slide showing in red, blue, and purple the major branches of Christianity. Red for Catholic Christianity, purple for the various Orthodox churches, and blue for the various Protestant churches. Pentecostalism, however, is the fastest growing type of Christianity still. It's growing in Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia, and elsewhere. There's been a proliferation of churches. More than 20,000 denominational families can be found around the world, according to the World Christian Encyclopedia, most of which have emerged in the last century. Even, as I mentioned, those church mergers from the ecumenical movement of the 20th century have left some congregations behind, leading inadvertently to new denominational splitting. In terms of the global south, Christianity has declined, in fact, in many Western nations, like in Europe and North America and so on, but it's been growing in the global south, such as in Africa and Asia. More missionaries intent on conversion come from the global south than from Western nations. So the current missionary spirit of Christianity is largely being directed from people in the developing world, in other parts of the so-called global south. Basically, it's a way of talking somewhat poetically about parts of the world outside of Europe and North America. There's also political divisions today in Christianity, so liberals across a variety of denominations, Catholic, Protestant, etc., often have more in common with each other than with the conservatives or traditionalists in their own denomination, such as liberal Presbyterians versus traditional Presbyterians, for example. The liberal Presbyterians are often very similar in their ideology, for example, around gay rights and gay marriage and transgender rights and things like that, with secularists in their society, whereas traditionalists of a variety of Christian denominations often reject certain aspects of modern political progressivism. Some denominations even split over disagreements between their liberals and traditionalists, like the Presbyterians, for example, in the United States specifically. In Africa, 80% of people are Christian and 20% are Muslims. It's actually kind of hard to see that from the maps because there's large areas, geographically speaking, or land-wise of Africa that are majority Muslim, like most of North Africa and large parts of Eastern and other parts of Africa too. But in terms of population, a lot of the most densely populated areas are majority Christian, thus giving the figure of approximately 80% of Africans are Christian. So that de facto makes Africa one of the main centers of Christianity today in the whole world. Before the 19th century, Africa had a lot of different indigenous religions, the local forms of animism and shamanism practiced by different peoples. It did have many Muslims, like in parts of North Africa and East Africa, and some Christians in too, such as the ancient Christian churches of Ethiopia and Egypt. But after the 19th and 20th century evangelical missionaries arrived, Christianity began to spread rapidly, although Catholic Christianity also began to spread in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, 147 million African Christians identify as renewalists or Pentecostals. Pentecostalism is still growing rapidly in Africa. Most African congregations are parts of denominations unknown in the West, which emerged locally, showing you there's a lot of native, indigenous creativity and ferment with regards to Christianity. In Nigeria, for example, there's a lot of large evangelical and Pentecostal megachurches that have their own compounds that function as small cities, have their own like supermarkets and banks and all kinds of apparatus, post offices, etc. You can see the interior of the worship space of one of these megachurches in Nigeria in the picture on the slide. In Latin America, there are around 425 million Catholics, which constitutes more than 40% of Catholics worldwide living in Latin America. Historically, there was an even larger percentage of the population that was Catholic. 90% were Catholic between 1900 and 1960. Now, only 69% identify as Catholic, although 84% were raised as Catholic. Around 20% of Latin American Christians identify as Protestant, although only 9% were raised Protestant. So there have been many converts from Catholic Christianity to Protestantism in Latin America, largely as a result of Western Protestant and missionaries, especially evangelicals and Pentecostals. Many of the converts to Protestantism cite a desire for what they perceive as a more immediate and personal relationship with God as their reason for leaving the Catholic Church. That concludes our survey of the Christian religion. Next up, we're going to look at chapter 5 from the textbook, which is on Islam. Until next time.